Good evening, everyone. Let the record indicate it is 5:02 p.m. and the Warwick City Council Finance Committee has been called to order. Need a motion for acceptance of the minutes on December 2nd.
Move favorable action.
Seconded.
We have a motion favorable. We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Moving on to PCR 19219, found on page 1. Good evening, Christy.
Good evening. Public Works is requesting to award the bid for fire sprinkler system inspection and repair in the amount of $15,000 to Pierce Fire Protection for a period of 1 year beginning February 23rd, 2020, expiring February 22nd, 2021.
Christy, in reviewing this, I see only one item that kind of jumps out, and that's on the Pilgrim Senior Center. I'm sorry, the 5-year internal inspections, and as you indicate in your report, that's only, and under this contract, it'll only be on the Pilgrim Senior Center.
Correct.
And I certainly agree with your department's decision to go along with Pierce because that is negligible in comparison to the other savings that you have in these other items. It's definitely works out into the taxpayer's favor. So I'm okay with it. Any questions with members of the committee? Any questions from members of the council? Any questions from members of the public? Do I have any questions from members of the public? Hearing none, I need a motion.
Move for favorable action.
Seconded.
We have a motion favorable. We have a second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. Thank you, Christy. Item 2020-203.
Good evening, Mr.
B,
Chairman.
excuse me, Director. Fire sprinkler system inspections. Go ahead, sorry. I heard some hollering. I figured it was like early.
James Scott, Parks and Recreation. We've reviewed the 2 bids received and recommend awarding the bid to Pierce Fire Protection for fire sprinkler system inspections and/or repairs. The contract terms will run from February 23rd, 2020 until February 22nd, 2021.
Thank you. Same comments or questions to you. Do you have anything that is due for the 5-year internal inspection?
We do not. I believe that reading through the packet, it seems to only apply to the Pilgrim Senior Center.
Okay. Okay. Any questions from members of the committee? Any questions from members of the council? Any questions from members of the public? Do I have any questions from members of the public? Hearing none, need a motion.
Move for favorable action.
Seconded.
We have a motion favorable. We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Item number 3, 2020-224, various replacement auto parts found on page 13.
Public Works is requesting to award this bid to all vendors that submitted a bid in the amount of $573,000 for a 1-year period beginning February 18th, 2020, expiring February 17th, 2021. This bid is, this cap is actually the same cap that we requested at the last meeting for the other parts. These 3 bids will be tracked all together under one lump sum of $573,000.
Christy, on the, and I get why you need to have all these various vendors. You know what the committee's position has been on this for the last 3 years, but I understand it. With Lawson Products, they will only be getting, if they're getting any business, will be on those, I think it's 6 items that they bid, correct?
Yeah, some of the vendors only provide things like hardware, and the smaller items. Other vendors provide the larger items. So it is purchases are made by what they bid on.
And I do need to recognize that your bidders, you got them to do what we've been asking to do for a long time, and that's provide the list price and the discounts and the net price. And it's, I'm happy to see that. I'm happy to see that you have a lot of vendors who are bidding on this. I remember when we started talking about this a few years ago, it was like, oh my God, it's impossible, it's too much work, we're not doing it, you're not going to get any bids, nobody's going to bid. Well, we see that the due diligence on the part of this committee, as well as the department heads, have certainly shown it to be something different, and the bids are much more competitive and more people bidding. The only thing I would like to recommend is a company like Palmer Spring. Palmer Spring, essentially, they only do springs, right? Perhaps just kind of tailor the parts list to what they would be bidding on.
Palmer Spring does provide some of the brake parts that we need, which is why they bid on this as an aftermarket. There's a separate bid for spring repair, but on
Okay.
this particular, it's not anything
Yeah,
spring related.
They bid on 2 items.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, good job with that, and it was good to see that. Any questions from members? Yeah, Councilman McAllister.
Thank you. And just to piggyback on what the chairman said, I agree, you know, there are multiple vendors on this, but we need the parts. We want to keep the things. But going out and getting them to submit all this information, it gives us a benchmark on costs going forward, so we see what we're doing. It allows the department to go through and pick the best price for the taxpayers. So I believe that what we've been doing is coming in results, bringing in results, and I want to thank the department for working on this, and I think this is a good progress. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Any other comments from members of the committee? Any comments from members of the council? Any comments, questions from members of the public? Any comments from members of the public? Hearing none, I need a motion.
Move for favorable action.
Seconded.
We have a motion for favorable. We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Also, I failed to point out earlier, I apologize, we have the numbers for each of the bids requests are in here, and there's adequate monies available in those accounts. If anybody would like to see it, it's right here. Next item, 2020-229, found on page 64. Good evening, Major.
Good evening. In November, the
Major, just identify yourself for the record, please.
Lori
Thank you.
Michaelides on behalf of the Warwick Police Department.
Thank you.
In November, the police department went out to bid for ammunition and received 3 qualified bids. The police department is recommending that this award be awarded to AAA Police Supply, even though they are not the lowest bidder. Ammunition purchased under this bid will be used for the department's annual qualification, night shoot in-service training, remedial training as necessary, and other trainings that often become available on short notice. Additionally, ammo is purchased for SWAT team training, they train twice a month, and for recruits who attend the Rhode Island Municipal Police Academy. I do not take lightly that this recommendation will cost more money. AAA Supply has been the lowest bidder, or the only bidder, for each of the last 5 years. They are located in Dedham, Mass., and our experience during that time period has been when we place an order, we receive a delivery within a week, usually within 2 or 3 days. Conversely, Eagle Point is in New Jersey, and although bidding lower, has given us a delivery window of 1 to 4 months. 4 months is a very concerning time frame for us. When it comes to recruitment and or last-minute trainings, things that are difficult for us to forecast, 4 months could be problematic. In addition to that, we have finite proper storage for ammo, so it's not like we can have a huge order the first of the year and only do 1 order per year. We just have no place to put that much ammo. If the need arises for additional ammo on a short timetable, I believe the 4-month delivery window could be problematic, and as such, we have recommended AAA Supply.
Thank you, Major. Major, you and I had a conversation on this earlier today, and we kind of explored this in depth. So, and thank you for giving me the inventory on the ammo that I had requested. that was most helpful. So what we have here is a series of items that you use on a sometimes little basis, sometimes regular basis. Your most popular is the 9mm rounds. That's for your training.
That's correct.
The least used is the 223. That's for the rifles for the vehicles. That's the least used.
That's correct.
That is also the only item that is a positive swing on the price and the cost of this ammunition, the amount of $536. When I tabulate the items based upon your projected needs for this year, I come up with a delta of somewhere between $3,000 and $3,200 more. It could even be a tad more than that if we take into consideration you use very few of the 223s. So we're looking at least a $3,200 increased cost to going with AAA police supply versus Eagle Point. The majority of the rounds that you're looking for based on our conversation is for training.
Correct.
And new recruits. We don't anticipate having any new recruits until April at the earliest, perhaps July or August, depending upon where things go.
The academy starts in July, but we're in the middle of a recruitment drive right now, so we won't have a list until April.
Okay. So you don't need ammo for that till April.
Correct. Till July.
July.
Yeah.
In the conversation that we had, I expressed my feelings with you is from inventory control. You obviously have a good inventory control because you or your armorer, whoever's in charge of the inventory, produced it in a relatively short period of time. So you have a good control on it. You have a good handle for it. You personally know what your more popular rounds are and what you use on a more steady basis. My feeling with this is for $3,200 that I would expect the armorer to be able to do a very efficient job in ordering this ammunition. In this case, you're not going to, and by the way, on the training ammunition, you're still sitting on 12,000 rounds of ammunition as we're here today, and a relatively good supply on the others.
Some of that is actually allocated for the January academy. We have 3 recruits scheduled to go in a couple weeks.
Okay.
So that's,
But as long as the armorer is keeping track of this inventory, and you know, from what you've just said, it's at least 4, 5, maybe even 6 months down the road before you're going to have this influx of ammo requirements, I don't see where the lead time of 1 to 4 months should pose any problem for the department, have any impact on training. It will if all of a sudden somebody says, oh my God, I forgot to order the ammo and we've got a leave time. Well, then, you know, that's something that would need to be addressed by the person who is responsible for ordering the ammo. And that's my feelings with it. I don't see a justification for burdening the taxpayers with an additional $3,000 or $3,200 of expense when they're certainly heavily burdened enough with so many other things, particularly where this is something that I'm very confident that the department's going to be able to control. And, you know, you certainly demonstrated that as your armorer did with getting this list that quickly. So I'm very confident that the department has very good control on it. I'm very confident that the department is going to be able to anticipate in the proper lead time to get the ammo that you need. So for me, I'm not going to be able to support awarding to AAA when there's such a difference in costs. Any questions from members of the committee? Councilman Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Chair Major, in response to the chairman, do you feel that there's any urgency or need where you would have to, I understand you explained your reasoning very well, but if the chairman was to go ahead and we were to join and understanding the cost, and he makes a very valid point. Do you have any counterpoint of why you feel that this would be
Again, the
that
issue
maybe
is-
we're not aware of as
Yeah,
non-law enforcement?
The
Thank
issue,
you.
again, is anything that we're not able to forecast. So anything that we can plan for, obviously we can plan for. It's the trainings that come up, and/or if a bunch of people retire and suddenly we're putting twice the amount of people in the academy that we have to plan for. Each recruit has to go to the academy with upwards of 3,000 rounds. So it's the unknown factors, so I don't know if we're going to have a problem until we actually have a problem, if we place an order. If it can deliver within 60 days, I don't think we have a problem. But if it takes them 4 months, and for example, this recruitment drive, right now we probably have 5 slated to go to the July Academy, but our recruitment drive isn't done till April, and a lot can change between now and then. We might end up sending 10 people. We might end, so that doubles the amount of ammo. We just went from 15,000 rounds to 30,000 rounds. So that's what I'm talking about, the unknown factor. Now, as soon as we know, we can place an order. If they can deliver on the shorter end, we'll be fine. But if they take 4 months on every single order, it could be problematic.
Is one of these your current supplier now?
Yes,
And may I ask which one?
AAA.
Okay. And for the same reasons, did Eagle Point compete last time?
Yes. No, I'm sorry.
okay.
This is the first time Eagle Point has
Okay.
participated in the last 5 years.
So all right, I'm all set. Thank you, Major. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman Howe. Also, I would like to just remind you all of what the Major said earlier, that this is the first time in some time that we've had additional vendors bidding on this ammunition. And over the last 3 years, this committee has been very diligent on requiring, or I should say requesting, that the department heads change the culture of how they go out for bid and change the demographics of how they award bids from one vendor to 7 or 8 vendors. And this is a perfect case in point. We have 2 additional vendors who have not bid on this, at least in some time. And let's face it, if you are the only vendor of something, who's holding your feet to the fire to come up with a better price? You're the only vendor. You know that. You know there's no one else been bidding. I know that from bidding myself. And now we have an opportunity to save the taxpayers upwards of $3,200, perhaps more. The academy isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time to put together this academy. It's not something that, happens today or tomorrow. We got an academy. I need another 15,000 rounds. Listen, this is about inventory control. It's about operating from a business perspective that you know what you got now, you know what you're going to have later, you know what you're going to need. Inventory control. That's it. As long as we maintain inventory control, and this is quite evident that the police department has been doing a very good job with that, then this shouldn't be a problem. Worst case scenario, we miraculously can put together a new recruit drive, and in 3 days or 3 weeks or whatever, you need 1,000 rounds, it can be done with a 3-3. So I don't see this creating any problems. What I do see it doing is making something that's working very good now work even a little more efficiently. Any other comments? Councilman McAllister.
Major, does Eagle Point, do they have a history of supplying for a city the size of Warwick? Is that why they may?
I don't believe up in this area. They're very big in New York and New Jersey.
Okay, so they do work with
They are a
municipalities.
large supplier for that
Okay, so
particular
that's
area.
not the reason for they say up to 4 months?
AAA has a warehouse where they keep our ammo in inventory. That's how we're able to get it so quickly. Eagle Point suggested they were going to ship directly from the manufacturer, and that's the times they gave us based on the manufacturer's recommended ship time. So they seem like they're a large supplier too, but they utilize the manufacturer more often.
Okay, thank you.
So I don't know if everyone received this or not, but I have an email that was forwarded to me from Eagle Point, and this person stipulates, as we are the current New Jersey state contractor for Federal, Remington, Polyfang, PMC ammunition, Federal, Remington being huge manufacturer of ammo, New York state contractor for Federal, Remington ammunition, Connecticut state contractor, New Hampshire state contractor, et cetera, they certainly indicate they have the ability to handle it. As a matter of fact, they state that it equates to approximately 30 million rounds of ammunition. It's a few rounds. Yeah. And also, Major, I would point out, I'm certainly the first one to complain about things, but I'm certainly the first one to give kudos when they're due. The accolades with the conversation that this individual had with you was it was exemplary. Your professionalism, your courtesy, et cetera, et cetera. So, thank you for that as well. Any other questions from members of the committee? Any questions from members of the council? Any questions from members of the public? Do we have any questions or comments from members of the public? Hearing none, I need a motion. I'm sorry, the motion is to award this bid. We're going to need a PCR on this.
194.19.
PCR 19419. The motion is to award the bid to Eagle Point Gun. We have a
I'll
motion.
second.
We have a second.
Second.
We have 2 seconds. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Major, and thank you for taking the call today and for your due diligence on this as well.
And then we gotta move it one time.
Sorry, I'm sorry. As amended, PCR 19419.
Favorable action.
Seconded.
We have a motion for favorable. We have a second as amended. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Okay, next item, need acceptance of the minutes from December 2nd.
Seconded.
We have a motion for favorable. We have a second. All in favor? Aye. PCR 129, I'm sorry, PCR 192-19, resolution relatives to bids. First item, PCO 19-19, ordinance of the City Council authorizing the purchase of street lights, the conversion of fixtures to light emitting diodes, LED technology, and the financing thereof through an appropriation obligation and determining other matters in connection therewith. For second passage, Councilwoman Travis. We have a recommendation for favorable action. Do we have a second? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Seconded.
We have a motion for favorable. We have a second. Before I continue on, any comments from members of the committee? Any comments from members of the council? Any comments from members of the public? Do we have any comments from members of the public? Hearing none, I need a motion.
Seconded.
We have a motion for favorable. We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Would someone just close that door to the outside foyer, please? Thank you. Moving on, item 2, PCO 20-19. An ordinance of the City Council authorizing the design, construction, repair, rehabilitation, and improvement of streets and sidewalks in the city, including but not limited to paving, drainage, traffic control, devices, safety improvement, and landscaping, and the financing thereof through an appropriation obligation and determining other matters in connection therewith. For action, Councilwoman Travis. Need a motion?
I move favorable action on PCO 20-19 for second passage.
Seconded.
We have a motion, we have a second. Any other questions from members of the committee or comments? Any comments or questions from members of the council? Any questions or comments from members of the public? Any comments or questions from members of the public? Hearing none, I need a motion.
Seconded.
We have a motion for favorable, we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Next item, PCO 17-19, an ordinance relative to senior and veteran exemptions. Councilman Howe, any preference on, it's not drafted.
Mr. Chairman, I would recommend we hold to the first meeting of February.
Hold till February 3rd.
Second, holding February 3rd.
We have a motion to hold to February 3rd. We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Thank you.
PCR 186-19, resolution relative to bond approval for the 2020-2021 school department projects. Release of funds. Council President Marola.
That has to do with the school bonds?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't know if the school department was here to speak on that.
Sorry?
I didn't know if the school department
Oh.
was here to speak on
Is
that.
anyone here from the school department? Is anyone here from the school department to speak on PCR 186-19?
If you could maybe bring it to the floor without a recommendation or hold it till the end of the meeting, I'll make a phone call.
At the recommendation of Council President, would you prefer to move it to the floor for a discussion, or would you prefer that I just, well, we only got one other thing left on the calendar. You want me to move it to the floor? Okay, at the request of the sponsor, move to the floor favorable for discussion.
Second that.
We have a motion, we have a second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. Correct. Favorable with no recommendation. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, next item, PCR 187-19, resolution relative to the ratification of collective bargaining agreement between the City of Warwick and the Warwick Firefighters Local 2748, IAFF, AFL, AFL, CO for a period of July 1st, 2019 through June 30th, 2022.
Thank you, Mr.
Good
Chairman.
evening, Director.
Honorable members of the Finance Committee. My name is William D. Pasquale. I'm the Chief of Staff. I'm here tonight to ask for your support in ratifying the tentative agreement by and between the City of Warwick and the Warwick Firefighters Local 2748 AFL-CIO for the period of July 1, 2019 through June 30th, 2022. A copy of the said contract and fiscal note was included in your binder, ready for pickup on December 6, 2019. In addition to the statutory hard copy, a PDF copy of the TA was sent via email to council members on December 4th, 2019. The entire red line contract was sent via Google Download Drive to all council members on November 26, 2019, some 20 days before this hearing. The information sent was robust and far exceeds any statutory requirements for review. As you may recall, when Mayor Solomon assumed office, there were many outstanding legacy issues left over from the previous administration. Public questions swirled regarding past TAs and how their components made their way into the contract language. A less than ideal process of merging a ratified TA with a contract document led to the creation of legal instruments of understanding that became known in the public as side agreements. After a systematic assessment, Mayor Solomon, without fanfare, shouldered swift action to correct immediate issues and provided long-term solutions because he believes the public deserves transparency as a principle of its governmental function, not as a means for self-promotion. Mayor Solomon recognizes the process itself was problematic and acted decisively to correct legacy problems while implementing a new procedure for review and documentation, thereby mitigating the need for side agreements while improving transparency for the public. The administration provided the actual language to be included in the collective bargaining contract. Every word, every line, every page, and every appendix. Laid out very simply. Changes would appear as read, would be underlined as an addition, would be stricken out for deletion. Sounds simple, right? Well, not exactly, because up to this point, the City Council and the public only received an abbreviated TA, which was more often summaries of the proposed changes, which then needed to be converted into actual language within the collective bargaining contract. Review of the past records and emails indicate former process produced numerous drafts with multiple authors, all floating around with different dates. This dissonance innately increased the likelihood of error and misinterpretation. Mayor Solomon's plan was to eliminate this shabby process and replace it with a transparent process that this public deserves. Up to this point, the city had no single depository for all signed collective bargaining agreements. We all know by now how difficult it is to locate an original signed collective bargaining agreement. Many times they were simply kept in the legal offices of varying solicitors at the time. Mayor Solomon's sensibility uses the city clerk's office as the established city archive to retain the original signed collective bargaining agreements, a process that includes an authorization page describing the document contents along with signatures, seal, and initialing every single page. I opine on this subject because it's so very important to be understood where we came from, and that several canons of this TA right the ship on these tangled matters. I believe everyone can agree that the mayor's actions and the new policy of the aforementioned matters are professional improvements over past practice. The instant TA corrects these outstanding issues, cleans up contract language, and sets a new course within the ratification and documentation procedure itself. Mayor Solomon, along with the firefighters, have bargained in good faith, drafting what we feel is a legal, fair, and equitable tentative agreement, one that addresses legacy issues as well as the short and long-term interests of this great city. While negotiations at times were demanding, Mayor Solomon's resolve and the firefighters' professionalism was truly something to behold. Mayor Solomon held steadfast on addressing OPEB within a cost-neutral contract for the taxpayer, while addressing outstanding issues inherited by his administration. The Warwick firefighters recognized without hyper-hysteria the need for fair and equitable contract, one that included other public employee benefits. We trust our firefighters into our homes and to transport our loved ones in their time of need and in the most stressful of situations. The qualities that embolden this trust are some of the same qualities exemplified by the firefighters at the bargaining table, wherein constructive dialogue overcame strong opinion and emotion. The result is a wage-neutral contract, alongside a first-of-its-kind employee-funded OPEB trust in the city of Warwick. The cost-neutral agreement addresses the immediate impact to the city's operating budget, while the First and Warwick employee-funded OPEB trust will reduce the city costs for health coverage for new hirees by nearly 1/3. This provision also creates a template to forge a new way forward in helping to manage retirement benefit costs in the future. Don't we all remember that not such a long time ago, our lexicon included the terms sick time, side agreement, tier 2, litigious items inherited from a previous time. As stated earlier, Mayor Solomon, when assuming office, acted quickly to cease implementation of the side agreement, and within the subsequent arbitrations and contract negotiations, the instant TA, the TA in front of you right now, would resolve both these matters. The proposed contract returns to a yearly payout schedule, eliminates ambiguity in the language and payout, while removing 4 sick days expected to save the city over $170,000 a year. This TA also resolves the long ballyhooed interest arbitration case that was a holdover from the previous administration. While this is often an area of rabid discussion, the facts clearly demonstrate on August 21st, 2019, in the matter of the City of Warwick versus Local 2748 IAFF American Arbitration Association number 01-17-0002-3208 entitled Change in Pension Benefits, the arbitration panel found that the firefighters' grievance was arbitrable, and the decision was that the city violated Article 14 of the collective bargaining agreement when it implemented terms of the city's pension ordinance from post-July 1, 2012, hirees to the Warwick Fire Department. Further, the arbitration decision stated that the city shall forthwith cease and desist from implementing or enforcing any portion of the Tier 2 plan under the amended ordinance enacted on May 10, 2011. Like it or not, fair or unfair, the city flat out lost this arbitration. This is an important fact because it's the arbitration case that places the distinction of what tier the subject class of firefighters are in, not Mayor Solomon or his administration. So any declaration that the TA would roll back the subject class to Tier 1 would be inaccurate, as this occurred when the arbitrator's decision came down in August. What does this TA do? It legally establishes through collective bargaining the long overdue Tier 2 pension savings for the taxpayers. It stops costly litigation and ends uncertainty. What is certain is that any discussion that a motion to vacate the binding arbitration award would be a quote-unquote slam dunk is not being intellectually honest. An award to vacate would at best be a fluke, with the probable outcome being years of costly, needless litigation, offering the same outcome which will only prolong the pension reform savings that the taxpayers deserve today. Can't we all stipulate with confidence that implementing Tier 2 pension reforms and ending the sick-time payout issues are good things for the taxpayer? If so, that's exactly what this TA delivers. Alongside this TA's neutral wage increases, Tier 2 pension reform, employee-funded OPEB trust, the proposed agreement contains first meaningful management rights clause, which is the first to express management rights provision in the city's collective bargaining history with the IAFF. First in history. The afforded management rights will dovetail effectively with implementation of a 24-hour shift schedule, which could help decrease overtime costs in the future. The proposed TA also introduces a new lower pay scale for new hirees while eliminating 1 holiday and 2 personal days, saving the city $280,000 a year. To conclude, this TA was a result of mutual interests by and between management and the IAFF, Warwick firefighters. They were respectful and discussed in good faith at the bargaining table. It is a worthy contract, one that cleans up legacy issues, minimizes downside risk, institutes pension reform, as well as addresses OPEB, saving taxpayers dollars while being fair to those that take care of all of us. Mayor Solomon, without seeking the media spotlight, remained resolute, respecting the legally mandated bargaining process, while the E-Board and rank and file fought hard for their body, never losing sight of the community that they serve. Our firefighters and their companions in blue are primary points of contact for the interaction of city and its residents. Every minute of every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they touch more individuals on a daily basis than anyone else in this room. Their tireless interaction with our loved ones, whether it be family, parents, children, or the elderly, demonstrate a steady beacon of strength, often under the most exacting of conditions. It's these attributes that make me believe our firefighters appreciate and care deeply about the issues facing our community, and they are willing to be part of the solution. In the end, Mayor Solomon's steady, unwavering diligence for the taxpayer was met with the IAFF resilient, balanced approach to community, creating professional tenets of change that are well represented within this contract. And as such, we ask for your support in the ratification of this TA. Before I bring up the Finance Director, Brian Sylvia, to speak to the fiscal note that was provided, I would also like to take the opportunity to introduce our team. On my left, I have Vin Ragasta, who is our labor attorney, City Solicitor Tim Bliss, and Mike D'Amico, Chief McMichael, and Brian Silva. If he's up, maybe you can come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you, Chief. As mentioned previously, the items within the tentative agreement that have a fiscal impact on the city on a going forward basis are as follows. A reduction of 2 personal days, a reduction of 1 holiday, reduction of 4 sick days, an increase of 2 years before new hires reach grade 1, an increase of 2 additional years before new hires reach grade 2 and grade 3 as well, an establishment of an OPEB trust with 2% of employee pensionable earnings to be contributed for new hires, establishment of a Tier 2 benefits for the pension system for new hires, a reduction of the unfunded liability for the pension fund, as well as a reduction of the pension ARC, and finally, salary increases of 0% in year 1, 2% in year 2, and 2% in year 3. Cumulative, these proposed changes have an effect of a savings of $613,473 in year 1, fiscal year 2020 that we're in right now, a savings of $189,647 in year 2, fiscal year 21, and a cost of $407,264 in fiscal year 2022, the third year of the contract, totaling net savings over the term of the contract of $395,856.
Brian, could you direct us where in the document it shows the backup math for the savings for 2020, 2021, et cetera?
The third page of the document.
And could you just review that?
Certainly. So as noted, the first item is the reduction of 2 personal days, which for year 1 is projected to have a savings of $133,074. In year 2, a savings of projected of $135,735. In year 3, projected savings of $138,450. The reduction of 1 holiday has projected savings in year 1 of $66,537. In year 2, projected savings of $49,237, and year 3 of $31,592. The unused sick, which is a combination of that is both the reduction of the unused sick is projected at $170,300 for the reduction of the 4 sick days. In year 2, it is projected at $270,097, and in year 3, a projected savings of $275,499. With regards to the reduction in pension ARC, this is associated with the reduction in 1 holiday. There's a projected savings in year 1 of $111,117. In year 2, there was a projected savings of $108,895, and in year 3, projected savings of $106,717. The final item is a combination of the impact of overtime and the projected savings on overtime with regards to some of these savings, as well as the impact for FICA and pension. And that is resulting in a projected savings in year one of $132,445, projected costs in year two of $43,970, and projected costs in year three of $202,836.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
just a question to Brian. Brian, in the contract, it says that the salaries will be set between 1.5 and 3%, according to the arbitration. So that's what the salaries are going to be. So we need a lifeline. Call a friend. So this is my question, Brian. What is it? What are the salaries? They're going to be set between 1.5 and 3, correct?
The salary,
Michael D'Amico, financial consultant to the city. I helped the team negotiate this
Mr.
contract.
D'Amico, could you raise your right hand since you're not a city employee and just have the clerk swear you in?
Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So first, if you could point me to the page of the contract that you're looking at, I will answer your question.
Let's see. Paragraph number
49.
1, paragraph number 1, page 1, I believe.
Oh, you're looking at the TA.
Mr. D'Amico, are you familiar with this contract?
I am familiar
Are you
with this
familiar with the
contract.
concept
I've
that it
read
hasn't, the salary hasn't been set?
So I will explain.
Well,
We had
so you
this
don't, so
this
do you
con-
know what when I asked that question, besides making me jump around to what page number it was on, did you understand my question or you didn't?
I wanted to be sure that I understand your question. It's
Okay.
always helpful to read the contract
Sure.
language you're referring to specifically, yes. So this contract starts with fiscal year 2020, July 1, 2019. There is still a year in arbitration. Fiscal year 19 is still in arbitration. That year has not been resolved, and the parties have agreed to a wage proposal, the city's wage proposal that was made quite some time ago, well in excess of a year or two ago, and is static in arbitration, is 1.5%. The firefighters' proposal was in excess of 3%, and they have since lowered it to that amount. So today, we are still waiting for the arbitrator's ruling on that fiscal year, and there will be a 1.5 to 3% increase, and that will be the starting point for this contract. However, having said that, the savings calculations are still correct because, as you can see, I'll use personal days as an example. The personal days save $133,000 the first year. The savings get slightly larger the second year because the salaries are slightly higher. And so when you take something away at a higher salary, the amount you save is higher. So the personal day savings get larger, meaning the savings and the costs of each of these lines will be, in the end, 1.5 to 3% higher than is shown here, and therefore the actual savings, instead of being $395,000, will be on the order of, conservatively, $398,000 to $405,000. However, in the interest of being conservative and not over-projecting the savings, we did not include the extra 1.5 to 3% that we expect to save. That's the first point. The second point is, when you ask, how is that the starting point for this contract, I would note that the salaries required, the financial need for that, the money required for that 1.5 to 3% increase has already been factored into the city budget in fiscal 20. It is already budgeted and therefore is not an impact of this contract.
So basically what you're saying is the salary increase is going to be someplace between 1.5 and 3, but you don't know.
For
Correct?
fiscal year 19, that is correct.
And so therefore, the projections, you don't know how to calculate either because it could be 1.5 to 3. So you can't give us a definitive answer to that question tonight either, can you?
That is not correct.
So you can give, just so you're aware, you're under oath, you're saying you can give a definitive answer as to what it's going to cost the city of Warwick when you don't know whether it's between 1.5 and 3%. Is that your testimony?
I gave you a definitive answer. You will save a minimum of $395,000. A minimum of. These projections are just that. They're projections. To assume that any number on this page is to the dollar, I don't think anyone would assume that, because we know somebody could retire tomorrow and we have one fewer firefighter, and now these projections are incorrect. These are projections, and you will save a minimum of $395,000. I would never swear under oath that you will save exactly $395,856 on a 3-year projection. That's impossible to determine, because you don't know who may retire between now and the end of the contract. Other things will happen to change these numbers, but this is at a minimum $395,000.
And you're asking Brian, our finance director, to make assumptions as to costs, correct? As to how much the salary is going to be, correct? In the third year.
Well,
You just said.
we calculated the salary in the 3rd year, yes.
And you're guesstimating because it's someplace between 1.5 to 3. That's not a fair answer?
That is not a fair answer.
Okay.
No.
Then we'll agree to disagree.
We'll agree to disagree.
Okay. And then based on those assumptions, you're asking what the impact could be to vacation time or sick time, right?
Yes.
Okay. Why not just give us a number, like all the other contracts that we've had?
I believe we did give you a number.
Why are we in a rush? Why are we? It's 1.5 to 3. Why? Every contract says what it is.
If you choose to wait, you will forego these savings. You will notice the largest savings are in the first year. Every day the clock ticks, the city loses money, not the firefighters union. That's the first thing. The second point, you said, why are we in a rush? The firefighter contract has expired a year and a half ago. I hardly think that signing a new contract a year and a half after the expiration of the old one is a rush. I would not classify it as a rush. I would say that if I were in the city's shoes, I would be anxious to start to achieve these savings as soon as possible, because the first year is the most beneficial for the city and the taxpayer. And if, as every day goes by without this being signed, these savings are lost and you cannot get them back in the first year. So there is an urgency. If I'm on the city's, if I'm sitting on the council, if I'm a taxpayer, there is an urgency to start to see these savings immediately and not wait.
I've been through this before, Mr. D'Amico, where we've rushed through things, and when you draft contracts, you want to be able to read it and figure out things. This is one issue out of many that I'm sure we'll talk about tonight that is ambiguous, to me at least, as to what it's going to be set at and what the financial impact is. And that carries over to sick time and vacation time, too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. D'Amico, so to stay on that, no, that's, do you have anything else to add? I'm going to just hold my comments till after. Do you have anything else to add with regard to the fiscal notes or the impacts?
I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I think Brian explained the overarching fiscal points quite eloquently in his fiscal note, so I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Brian, is there more? Did you want to go through any of the other fiscal notes? There's 2 other fiscal notes here as well.
I just should note that actuarial statements were provided with the impact for pension and OPEB. It's also included in your package.
Okay. So, Mr. D'Amico, I'm sorry, if you could come back for 1 minute. So with regard to the 2019, 2020, whether the salary is going to be impacted at 1.5 or 3, if you don't know what that number is, how can you project what the cost is of the personal days, sick days, holidays, unused sick time, the impact that it has on the pensions, and for that matter, on overtime.
So,
Because, just bear with me for a minute. So let's assume that the arbitration stays where it is at the moment. So how do you, what's going to happen to the overtime that was put in during that time period where, this wasn't settled? Isn't the overtime also going to be impacted somewhere between 1.5% and 3%?
yes, it would be, yes.
And wouldn't the fringe benefits be somehow impacted between the 1.5% and 3%?
Your pension, not your health care, but your pension would be, yes.
But when I say fringe benefits, let me back up. So your the FICA tax is going to be impacted. FUTA is going to be impacted.
Yes.
Any other items, workers' comp, whatever.
Yes.
That's all going to be impacted.
Yes.
And what is the salary amount that we're talking about that we're not sure if it's going to be impacted 1.5% or 3% or somewhere in between? What's that total amount?
A 1% increase per the
No,
calculation.
what's the, no. What I'm asking is, what is the total salary for that time frame? What's the total salary?
The total salary in the fire department on an annual basis is approximately, and you have it here in the chart, so you can refer to the chart. You can see the annual base salary at the top of the chart. In fiscal 19, the actual number was 14.3 million. The budget for fiscal 20 was approximately 15 million. It's here on the chart.
Okay, so
That's 1 year's salary.
okay, so that 1 year salary that we're talking about is 14.3 million.
Approximately, yes.
Approximately that. And the swing on that could be 1.5% to 3%, depending
Yes.
upon what the award is.
Yes.
And in addition to that is all the other unknowns, right? So we have the unknown of the 1.5 to 3 that impacts 14.3 million,
Yes.
which, in itself is a pretty good number. And then we have the unknown on all of the other items, sick days, holiday pay, unused sick pay, payout. The impact on overtime could be a relatively large number, being that we're talking about a large overtime number. So this number that is unknown is a fairly substantial number.
But again, it won't have an impact. It will be, as you stated, 1.5 to 3% of that figure, that 14.3 million figure. However, it will not have an impact on the budget, as that money has already been budgeted and allocated by this council. There is no impact. This is a fiscal impact statement. A fiscal impact statement is designed to say, by signing this contract, what will I have to do to the city budget next year to make these numbers fit? And my answer to you is, an increase of 1.5 to 3% has already been accounted for in the fiscal 20 budget that was passed by this council. There will be no impact next year on that increase. It is already baked in, as it were, and therefore the fiscal impact to the city of that, to the city budget, is zero. To answer your first question about how do we calculate the holiday, I'll give a simple hypothetical. Let's say that one firefighter, when that person works a holiday, that person earns $1,000 for the holiday. And that's not how much they earn for a holiday, but hypothetical. We know how much they earn. It's $1,000. So we know by eliminating one holiday, we are saving $1,000. If their pay were 1.5% higher, we would save $1,010 for that firefighter. So the savings would be greater, not lesser. And therefore, when I say that the savings are a minimum of $395,000, it is just that. Because if the pay increase is 1.5%, that means the savings from eliminating one holiday or one sick day or one personal day just got 1.5% higher. And we try to be conservative here and say the minimum we will save over 3 years is $395,000. Now, there are other ways, but I firmly believe this contract will save far more than that. For instance, the change to 24-hour shifts. I'm quite confident that that will save overtime. However, that is extraordinarily difficult to calculate because you're counting on not an actual change in the schedule, but a change in behavior. We believe it will lead to less sick time. I have done research that shows in other communities it does lead to less sick time usage and dramatic decreases in overtime, but we did not put that here. So there are numerous things that I think are additional savings in this contract, but we put the hard numbers here, and we believe this to be a conservative estimate. We will save at least $395,000. But I don't want the council to think that passing this contract, they run the risk of something coming out of the woodwork and we have to increase the budget because we did not account for it. That will not happen. This has all been accounted for in the budget already, and this is what will impact your next budget.
So when you say it's already been accounted for in the budget, has it been accounted for in the amount of 1.5%, 2%, 3%? What was it accounted for?
Since we're still in arbitration, I will answer your question, but I will preface it by saying normally that's a question that gets asked in executive session, because as soon as I tell you how much, as soon as I tell you how much we've budgeted, the firefighter's attorney is going to write that down, and I'm sure he will bring it up in the arbitration. However, I can assure you that sufficient money was budgeted to cover the range of 1.5% to 3%. And I think I would like to leave it at that, but I would assure you that sufficient money was budgeted to cover the range of 1.5% to 3%.
But right now, we don't know what the number is.
I know exactly what the number is.
You know it is.
I know exactly.
But we're the ones that are voting on it.
Well, it's
And
in the
we don't
budget
know.
very clearly. I could point it out to you.
Okay.
It's very clear in the budget.
I wasn't going to get into that right now, but you brought up the 24-hour shift.
Yes.
We've had our attorney review that as well. I'm sure you've seen the document that was sent out, and that is ambiguous at best, in his opinion, because of, I mean, how do you calculate this? Is it 10 hours? Is it 12 hours? Is it 24 hours? If you have this 24-hour shift and you have a firefighter who is working a 24-hour shift, if he has a day off, is it an 8-hour day off? Is it a 12-hour day off? Is it a 24-hour day off? Because that is not clear, at least to me and to our attorney who has reviewed it. It is not clear.
I'm going to defer to our attorney in a second, but I'll let him expound on the answer, but I will give you a fast answer. What's commonly referred to as a quote-unquote 24-hour shift, if you read the language of the contract, it's actually a 10-hour shift and a 14-hour shift back-to-back.
Back-to-back.
Back-to-back. Today, they work a 10-hour shift, and then a day or two later, they work a 14-hour shift. And that shift is what is considered a day. It has always been. It will continue to be so. A 10-hour shift and a 14-hour shift is a day. So if you take a sick day today, you call out for your entire 10-hour or your 14-hour shift. That will continue. It is not, and in no way is it called a full 24-hour shift. It is a 10-hour shift followed by a 14-hour shift, meaning you will call out one sick day for 10 hours and another one for 14. But I'm going to turn this over to our attorney who can explain this much more in depth than I can.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I think Michael explained it perfectly. That's the answer. It's a back-to-back 10 and 14-hour shift. So if a firefighter, if this contract were to be ratified and put in place, and a firefighter wanted to take a 24-hour period off, that firefighter would need to use 2 sick days.
Mr. Chair,
Sir.
could we have Mr. Harrington, rather than speak for Mr. Harrington, state what his concern
Sorry, I
is?
didn't realize he was here. By all means.
I was asked to review the contract for the council, and my observation on it was that on the face of the document, I couldn't tell what a sick day would be, because the sick days talk in terms of working days, and under the current schedule, it's a 10-hour shift, a day off, and then a 12-hour shift. So there's a separation between the shifts. So I thought it was ambiguous to now talk in terms of shifts, but sick days and vacation days talk in terms of days in the contract. That's where I thought the ambiguity was.
Can you tell us?
And you're in effect defining the days now in terms of shifts, because you're saying there's a 10-hour shift followed by a 14-hour shift, and that a person taking that period of time off would discharge 2 sick days. But that language and that explanation does not appear in the contract, which gave me rise to the observation of the ambiguity.
Could you just explain to us the significance of that when somebody else goes to review it other than the parties? When there's ambiguities?
I spend part of my time acting as an arbitrator in cases. They're either disciplinary cases or they're contract interpretation cases. And they typically develop when the parties who may have negotiated the language are no longer around. And now there are others coming in and giving interpretations to the contract language. It was from that background that I raised the question about ambiguity. Because when an arbitrator is asked to hear a case, the standard is that when the language in the contract is clear and unambiguous, then there's no, you just read the language and come up with a decision. But if the language is ambiguous, then the arbitrator allows the parties to go outside and to bring in from extraneous sources what may have been intended. Those cases get a little fuzzy and a little complicated as opposed to having clear and unambiguous language. That was the concern that I raised.
So, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Could you also answer the second part of that question?
Sure.
Or the first one, which was the issue that you raised, John, that we had just been discussing regarding the 1.5 to 3% on the ambiguity as to what the salary actually is.
Apparently the explanation, the page in the contract where the salaries would be set forth is blank because the starting salary hasn't been determined. Now the explanation for the purposes of the fiscal note is that the fiscal note is accurate because there's been a budgeted amount to cover the number that was put in the spreadsheet. But the contract itself at this point doesn't have any salary figures in it because the salary for the year that's not covered by this contract that occurs first, the 2018 year, hasn't been determined.
That's correct, because the arbitration award has not been issued yet.
And how is that problematic, John?
If the council's approving the contract, they're approving the contract without the salary provisions being actually in the document at this point.
And in particular with regard to the fiscal note, I think you had just, when we were talking a minute ago, you had questions about how that impacts the fiscal note.
Well, the explanation that I heard after our little sidebar was that the fiscal note is accurate as a fiscal note because it's using a figure for the year 2018 that was budgeted. So that's different. That's a different analysis than what the salary figures would be in the contract.
I believe this statement was, and Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, but the fiscal note reflects the minimum savings that the city will realize. Certainly the city could realize additional savings based on the amount that's awarded. And as to the amount that's been budgeted, the city has already budgeted for fiscal 2019 a sufficient amount to cover whatever amount is awarded in the interest arbitration. And it's important to understand that the interest arbitration that is currently going on, if this agreement is ratified, the firefighters essentially agreed to convert it to a high-low arbitration. The firefighters currently in the arbitration that's going on requested or proposed more than a 3% raise. They've reduced that in connection with this contract.
I agree. I mean, factually, that's all correct. My only observation was about the salary page in the contract had no figures in it. The explanation about the fiscal note is that there's been a budgeted amount. When the budget was adopted last June, that budget that's in place right now has a figure, or has an amount, that would cover the salary for the missing year. That's all. That was the explanation. I understand the explanation, but it hasn't been turned into actual numbers in the contract yet.
Right, and unfortunately, it might be a chicken and the egg issue, but that number can't be obtained before the firefighters are giving something up in connection with that interest arbitration. They're not going to give something up unless they have the contract. They have no incentive to do that. So and we've already gone down the road. The interest arbitration is going on. We can't get that award at the reduced terms that the firefighters have agreed to until we get the contract ratified.
So we have this 24-hour shift thing that it's been spoken to, that it's not spelled out in this contract right here that we have. We have the unknown between the 1.5 and the 3. Well, what is it going to be? So isn't this how we are in this arbitration thing in the first place? Because what we have is we have unknowns, and we have not a clear, concise. You just spoke to it as far as the 24 hours and what you meant it to say, or whoever put this document together, is what it was intended to mean and what was it intended to say. But that is not what it says. And it's not spelled out here specifically. So I'm sitting here thinking that, you know what? We're already in a spot right now where we may end up with close to a $3 million additional expense on an arbitration that, for whatever reason, it's been decided not to appeal because we didn't have all the information, because the council didn't have all the information. And now we have a contract that we're saying meant one thing, but it doesn't say that.
So
it doesn't say
to-
that.
To
So
address,
how can,
to address your points, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
You asked about the 1.5 to 3, and you said, isn't that vague, and don't we need more information before we can approve this? But I think what's important to point out is, if you don't approve this contract, you will not get an arbitrator's award between 1.5 and 3. Right now, the firefighters have, before the arbitrator, proposals for raises well in excess of 3%. They are lowering that to 3 as a condition of this. This was a global agreement. They would agree to lower it. So we run the risk of an arbitrator awarding far more than 3% if this is not ratified. So we have brought some certainty to what was a very ambiguous process. Also, the firefighters in their proposal proposed increases to minimum manning and many other things that an arbitrator could theoretically award them. So if this contract is not ratified, it is not simply a matter of waiting to see if the arbitrator awards 1.5 to 3. If this contract is not ratified, the arbitrator can award far more than 3. The arbitrator could award an increase in minimum manning, could award a 4 or 5% increase. So it's not a matter of let's wait and see what will it be, 1.5 to 3, and then we will fill in the blanks. That capping of their increase at 3% and their agreement to withdraw all of their other dangerous proposals, dangerous if you're on the city, if you're a city taxpayer, was contingent on this full package. So I would say that there's a misconception if you believe that you can wait for a 1.5 to 3 and then approve this. That's my first point. And I don't want to downplay the nature of the firefighters' proposals that they took off the table in that arbitration, because they would cost the city easily, an increase in minimum manning is millions of dollars. It's not hundreds of thousands of dollars if that were to get approved by the arbitrator. That's the first thing. And then when you talked about a day, the contract language really has not changed from what it has always been. It has always said that a shift is 10 hours and 14 hours, and a firefighter has always called out for a shift, and that was always one sick day. And that is still true. It's just that now the shifts are back to back. And I understand that the attorney said, well, the language on that is not clear, but I would point out the language has not changed. All we did was move the shifts to be back to back. We've not really changed what a shift is or what a day is. It's the same it's always been for the last 30 years.
So are they working 10 hours or are they working 24?
They're working a 10-hour shift followed by a 14-hour shift.
So they're working
But
24 hours?
No, it is specifically called out in the contract that it is a 10-hour shift followed by a 14-hour shift. It does not say they are working 24 consecutive hours. It specifically says a 10-hour shift followed by a 14-hour shift. That language was precise to match the prior language where a shift is still a shift. It is not a 24-hour shift. It is colloquially referred to that way, but is not what the contract says.
If I could just address that, it is clear in the shift language that it's 2 separate shifts, 10 hours and 14 hours. That language is clear. Where I mentioned the ambiguity is in the articles dealing with vacation days and sick days, because that talks in terms of days. And as is being indicated here, 10 and 14 adds up to 24 hours, and that's a day.
Sure. So I can address that point. If I could just take one moment to, I think Councilman Lattiser asked, are they working 24 hours? Are they working 10 hours and 14 hours? The answer is, and I agree with everything Michael said, but most of the time they will work 24 hours. But is it possible they'll only work 10 or 14? Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons where the potential and the hoped for reduction in overtime costs come in. A firefighter who maybe has something going on in the day can call out for the 10-hour shift, but not the 14-hour shift, or vice versa. So it is possible that the firefighters will work 10 or 14, but not 24 hours. To answer the council solicitor's question, and I just want to go back to, I disagree that the contract is ambiguous as written, but we can certainly disagree on that. But in the event that there was an ambiguity that got brought to a grievance, the extrinsic evidence that gets put forth in the arbitration is you can look at the past practice of the parties. And as you said, it's very clear we have a 10 and a 14-hour shift here. And the past practice of these parties, as far as I'm aware in their bargaining history, has always been 1 holiday, 1 sick day is equal to 1 shift, 1 tour of duty. You can also provide evidence of the bargaining history. Specifically in this case, it's not an accident that the firefighters, when they gave back sick days, they gave back 4 days, so they're now at 16 days. You'll see a reference in the contract that if the city, in its discretion, the city has the discretion to opt out of this Boston schedule, as we're calling it, after 1 year, if the savings don't materialize. And it ends up costing the city more money. The city can opt out. You'll see that the firefighters will actually give back, they'll lose another sick day, so they'll go down to 15 sick days. They'll gain some personal days on the other side. But the reason for that is for this exact reason. There needs to be an even number of sick days each year because of the split shift. So to take off a full 24-hour period, they need 2 sick days. So if they have 16 sick days for the year, that allows them to take off 8 24-hour periods.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just a question, Mr. Harrington. If you had to amend that language to make it clearer, how would you address that?
I think in the sections for vacation and sick. See, I happen to be looking at the vacation section, that article, and the accrual of vacation days is based on years of service. And the accrual starts off at 12 working days. So that section, as I mentioned before, talks in terms of days. If it was going to be converted to shifts, then a sentence someplace in the contract that said, the accounting for this is on the basis of shifts, or shift equals days, something like that. It would be on paper what you're reciting, Tim.
Mr. President?
I think Mr. Harrington answered the question. The whole idea of having a contract is so when you read it, you understand it. Because if it does not come out in the wash, as Attorney Blish said, then what you're looking at is a vacation day being 24 hours, which basically doubles the amount of vacation days or doubles the amount of sick days. And I don't think that that's anyone's intent on this council, and I hope no one's intent in the audience. And so that's why it's important to make provisions that are clear, so if we're looking at this, or somebody else is, and we're all not there, that they understand what the intent of the parties was. And in my opinion, it can be read either way, and having more litigation as, one of the reasons that is being articulated as to why we should settle that is because litigation is costly and time-consuming and unknown. Well, when you have provisions like this, that brings you right into that realm. So, in my opinion, you say what you mean. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Anything else?
I have nothing unless the councilors have questions.
Okay, I'll defer to my colleagues on the committee. Councilman McAllister?
Thank you very much. Like everyone on the council, I have read this contract and have spoken to a number of people in my ward about it. Here are some of the questions and concerns I've heard about the contract and the information I've received. Timing. When did I receive the contract? The entire council received the entire contract, not just the TA, on November 26th. As a council member, it was then my responsibility to use the time from November 26th to today, December 16th, to be prepared to speak and vote on this contract. The second question I received is why drop the, quote, appeal on the Tier 2 arbitration ruling? As a number of people and a number of council members have asked about this, we received on December 10th a statement from Vin Regasta, the city's labor attorney. His statement details two different parts of this process. His dissenting opinion in the Tier 2 pension arbitration was just that, an opinion as the city's partial arbitrator. The second part is as for an appeal, he stated in his judgment there is virtually no probability of success in seeking to vacate the so-called Ryan Award. Appeal of this ruling is a misnomer because the RI law does not permit an appeal. It only allows for applications to Superior Court to vacate labor arbitration awards on a very limited grounds. If the city were to seek an application to vacate the Ryan Award, it would result in significant legal expenses with a very low probability of success, especially given the judicial deference accorded to the rulings of the labor arbitrators. Simply said, the RI, Supreme Court, and Superior Court defer arbitration decisions which are based on plausible interpretations of a collective bargaining agreement, and they do not vacate such awards. The Attorney Regasta says, I reiterate my belief that while the Ryan Award was an unfortunate outcome for the city, It was a plausible interpretation of the collective bargaining agreement, and therefore extraordinarily unlikely to be overturned on appeal. So that is the response that I am giving to individuals who reach out to me regarding the quote-unquote appeal. I've also received questions about the language on page 64 in regards to management rights. Vincent Regasta also addressed this in his statement to the entire council. He points out that RI and federal courts have consistently ruled that employee pension benefits are mandatory subjects of collective bargaining. The idea that mandatory subject matters of collective bargaining may be bypassed by the enactment of an ordinance is sheer nonsense. This paragraph merely acknowledges which is already well-settled law and does not forfeit the city's rights in any way. We've also received questions about the employee-funded OPEB trust. As stated in this contract, new employees will contribute to their health care costs in retirement. While I'll acknowledge, and we all acknowledge, that this does not address the OPEB costs for the current employees, it does move us in the correct direction. Had we have done this for new hires 10 or 20 years ago, we would be in a much better place today. The 24-hour shift schedule, this gives the city a year to see if this shift schedule can decrease overtime costs. If it does not work, we have the option to move back to what we have today. I've also received questions, and this is what I would like to ask one of the representatives, to please outline the difference between Warwick's situation and what has taken place in Cranston and Providence, what they have done in the past.
Thank you, Councilman. Can I bring up City Solicitor Tim Bliss and Vin Regasta?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Attorney. One of the questions that I have received is in the paper last week. They talked about what happened in Cranston when they addressed some issues, and I would like to if you could talk to us about the situation that the city of Warwick is in compared to what Cranston was in when they enacted some changes.
And when you refer to Cranston, Councilman, are you referring to the suspension of the COLA?
Correct.
The temporary suspension of the COLA. So that is, so the contract that we're referring to here, obviously, is the active employees. What occurred in Cranston was in response to a specific fiscal emergency. Essentially, the pension system was in danger of failing, and there was a temporary suspension of the retiree COLA, already retired individuals. I mean, I don't know how technical you want me to get, but it was essentially, it was a exercise of the police power by the state because a determination had been made essentially that the pension system was going to fail if this temporary measure wasn't put in place. It's akin to a taking of public property, which, while disfavored under the law, can happen under certain circumstances, and under the very unique circumstances in place in Cranston at the time, that was permitted to go forward, or to take place.
So even if the city of Warwick qualified for those type of things, it would not have been included in a contract like this?
No, it wouldn't. And when you say if the city of Warwick qualified, the situations are light years apart. The city of Warwick's financial condition currently is not where the city of Cranston was when those provisions were put in place.
But even if they were, they'd still not be included in this type of contract?
Not in this agreement, no. And it couldn't be included in this agreement because collective bargaining agreements do not apply to already retired individuals. The individuals in Cranston were not represented by the Cranston police and fire unions because they can't be. The Rhode Island Supreme Court has been emphatic on that and has ruled repeatedly to exactly that.
So the people that have reached out to me that were concerned and upset that this was not included in this particular contract, that is the reason why it's not applicable.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair?
You all set, Councilman?
Yeah, could I ask
Sure,
a
Mr.
question of
President.
Mr.
Go ahead.
Bliss and Mr. Augusta? In particular, Mr. Augusta, your dissent on the arbitration listed a number of reasons why you disagreed with that decision, correct?
Of course.
Okay. Could you list those reasons for us? What
Off
you
the top
listed
of
in
my
your
head,
dissent?
I can't quote them verbatim to you. You have
Well,
the opinion.
sure. Well, why don't you
Mr.
give us a
Regasta, could you
summary?
just speak into the mic, please?
If you could give us a
I can't give you a verbatim.
Can you give us a summary?
I made the only arguments that could be made in a case that was a loser. And that's a frank, intellectually honest answer. This city has operated under a delusional belief that ordinance passage can somehow modify a mandatory subject of bargaining. And that's unfortunate. I don't know the reasons why. I don't know who was advising the council at the time in 2011. But the outcome led to this grievance arbitration that was most unfortunate for the city. And so what I did in my role as a partial arbitrator is attempt to try to persuade the majority of the arbitration panel that there might be a different outcome, and here's the reason why. But that 1953 legislation of the General Assembly that created or enabled this community to enact an ordinance to create a pension system by ordinance does not negate decades of state and federal law that state quite unequivocally that the subject matter of pensions, benefits, employee contributions, employer contributions must be negotiated. In a word, it's mandatory. So what I wrote in that dissenting opinion was advocacy on behalf of the city in a case that I was asked to sit as a partial arbitrator. I could not change the facts. I could not go back in time and dispense legal advice to a council in 2011 that enacted this ordinance or an administration that at that time felt that the expedient of this ordinance would somehow allow pension benefits in a collective bargaining relationship to be changed. I could not do that. So that's why I indicated in the statement that the dissent was written in the context of an arbitration award and decision. I was in effect playing the role that I was engaged to play as an advocate. Now, here we are looking at the outcome, and we're looking at the prospects of what many people have called an appeal. An appeal is a misnomer, as I indicated in the statement, because under Rhode Island law, there's no direct appeal of an arbitrator's award. There are very limited grounds, and the procedure is in Title 28, Chapter 9. It's an application to vacate, and it's an application to the court based on very limited grounds, such as fraud, acting in excess of authority. The prospects of success are abysmal, in my opinion. And I would venture to say that if you sought the opinions of a number of members of the bar that practice labor law, both on the federal level and the state level, you would, and management side or labor side, you would get the same opinion. So there are a lot of subtleties associated with an examination of Article 14 of the collective bargaining agreement. I know there are a lot of armchair attorneys out there that are commenting publicly about what the snippet of a reference of Tier 2 might mean legally. And I know that there are folks that believe the mere mention of an ordinance in a collective bargaining agreement somehow magically converts that subject matter as something that does not have to be bargained. But in 1976, the Rhode Island Supreme Court was crystal clear in citing the requirement to mandatorily negotiate pensions. Why? Because the General Assembly, when it enacted the Firefighters Arbitration Act, required mandatory collective bargaining with respect to wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment. And you as an attorney, Mr. Marola, and Mr. Harrington as an arbitrator and an attorney, and some of the attorneys in this room know that the Rhode Island Supreme Court has said on a number of occasions that they look to federal jurisprudence to aid them in applying labor law. Why? Because federal courts have decided labor law issues going back to the 1930s and going forward. And so there is much more abundant case law to rely on. But here's the principle that stands out in federal case law, that pensions, pension benefits, contributions, employee and employer side are mandatory subjects of bargaining. So that's why I offer a strong opinion. And I offer that strong opinion because process matters in labor law. Process matters. And I look at what happened in 2011 and 2012, and I think it's most unfortunate. And again, I wasn't here, I don't know why. But if the union's attorney that they have currently, an outstanding attorney, Joseph Penza, if we were here involved in this issue and looking at how do we reform collective bargaining, we would be in unison in this one concept, that it must be negotiated and it cannot be legislated. Simply said, you can't leapfrog the collective bargaining process by ordinance. If that were the case, there would be chaos in municipal collective bargaining. I'm going to say one other thing to consider. I know that there are public critics about employee pension benefits. And I know there are many folks that believe that terms and conditions of employment in public sector contracts are too rich, and particularly those benefits that are the pension benefits and the health care benefits that really drive costs. What Rhode Island has not done, and where the solution may be, is in the state legislature, like other state legislatures that have removed as mandatory subjects of bargaining pension and health care. And they have removed it because it is too critical and too expensive a subject matter to leave to the vagaries of bargaining and arbitration. And have arbitrators, when you think about this, we talk about interest arbitration. Mr. D'Amico talked about the range of 1.5% to 3.5%. I will tell you this, I've done more interest arbitrations than anybody in this room, I guarantee you that. Maybe with the exception of Mr. Penza, who's here. We both would agree, and I think any intellectually objective and honest arbitrator, a lawyer would agree, it's not a good process because you've turned over the checkbook, the management, and the control of your enterprise to a third-party arbitrator, and that arbitrator will impose a contract on you, and in almost every instance, it will be something that will be problematic, both fiscally and operationally. So what I think this tentative agreement does, as the Chief of Staff had indicated, is it removes legacy problems, it buys certainty for the town, it brings about some cost control, it eliminates risk in the pending interest arbitration because it shouldn't be understated that even though we have that 1.5% to 3% high-low, if you will, range for the interest arbitration panel to set salary, and by the way, that has to be set in conjunction with the evidence. So it could be closer to 1.5, it could be closer to 3. But we've eliminated the risk on all of the other subject matters that are out there. And those are very daunting costs because, believe me, you don't want Warwick to be the first community where an arbitrator awards minimum staffing as has been proposed. That would be devastating fiscally to the city.
Mr. Augusta, thank you for your explanation. I also recognize that it's not an easy position for you to be in to disagree with your own dissent, but to refresh your recollection about your dissent and the reason that this city appealed, oh, and I say appeal, you're correct, I don't want to use that word, filed a lawsuit seeking to reverse that decision.
An application
is because, one, it was going to be a case of first impression in Rhode Island. There's no case law in Rhode Island looking at our pension ordinance that came before the collective bargaining ordinance for the state of Rhode Island. So in that case, it would be a case of first impression. The second issue, which you pointed out eloquently in your dissent, was that this sat in the drawer procedurally for 3 years, where they didn't follow the procedures that were in the contract that talked about your time frames for appeal. And those are very good arguments. So while I understand what your position is and that it's not easy to disagree with the dissent, I'm also concerned that the attorneys that were hired on behalf of the city of Warwick, the attorneys that filed the lawsuit on behalf of the city of Warwick, are not here representing the city of Warwick. Instead, we get an opinion from you, instead of the attorneys that are actually involved in the litigation, involved in the discovery, going to see the judge, telling us what the judge is seeing, how the judge is interpreting these issues, briefing the issues. I find that very disconcerting that those attorneys aren't here. I mean, if I had an attorney and I wanted an opinion from the attorney that was handling my lawsuit, I'd ask the attorney that's handling my lawsuit, not somebody that isn't. So those issues are very disconcerting for me. And when we talk about these provisions, whether laws or ordinances control collective bargaining agreements and how they're to be interpreted, I find it interesting that we would need some of the language that Councilman McAllister referred to on page 64, if it's not a concern for anybody. For example, not all of the terms of the pension ordinance are set forth in this agreement. To the extent that particular terms have been omitted in this agreement, the pension ordinance shall govern the matter, in question. It goes on to state, to the extent that the terms of this agreement are inconsistent with the pension ordinance, the terms of this agreement shall govern. I don't think I've seen that in any collective bargaining agreement in the state of Rhode Island.
I have.
You have?
I have, and I would direct your attention to read some of the decisions of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, particularly the decisions in 1976, in the East Providence case involving the IAFF and
I'm talking
the
current.
FOP.
You're saying current contracts have this language, that the written agreement controls laws of the city of Warwick, ordinances of the city of Warwick.
I have seen collective bargaining agreements that refer to ordinances, in essence, the collective bargaining process and the ultimate agreement that's consummated contractualizes the ordinance. Just like in many collective bargaining agreements, you see the state employees' retirement system where they reference the state statute in the collective bargaining agreement, and sometimes you have alterations in the system, the state system. So it is not uncommon to see references where there is an intertwining, if you will, between ordinance or state statutes, such as the state employees' retirement system and the collective bargaining agreement. But what's notable about that is the references are within the collective bargaining agreement. In other words, the parties have met, they've conferred, they've discussed what the pension benefits are. In some cases, they reference an ordinance. In some cases, they reference a state statute. and they may make provisions with respect to any inconsistency or conflict and how it's to be resolved. And I can, by the way, I can give you an example of sort of the converse. I argued a case in the Supreme Court a couple of years ago for the city of Cranston where they had the so-called roundup rule. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a sort of an odd provision where if you work 6 months in a day, you can round up your service. You get a full year of service for 6 months in a day. Well, what happened is the parties had made an agreement, as they should have in the collective bargaining process, that the 6 months in a day would count. But what they did not do after they made their agreement is they didn't go to the General Assembly and have the state pension statute modified to allow for a roundup rule in that particular municipality, as other municipalities had done. The point being that there is an interplay between statutes and ordinances and a collective bargaining agreement, but there still must be mandatorily dialogue and discussion and agreement. Sometimes there's an agreement struck at the table. City of Providence will negotiate pension reforms, pension benefits, or in some cases a retraction of benefits, and then there's a requirement or an agreement at the table that the tentative agreement is subject to approval by the municipal legislative body. But there still has to be bargaining over what the substantive changes are to be in a pension. And Mr. Council President, that's why I felt, looking at what had happened in 2011 and when this ordinance was passed, that it was most unfortunate that no one asked the question, is this the proper process to bring about pension reform? I understand that the pension reform was needed and that it was a laudable goal for this city. And I think the intentions of the council were perfectly good and sound. But what people didn't think about or consider back then is how do we actually go about and lawfully implement these reforms? It wasn't done. It just wasn't done right. Now, I'm not counsel of record on that case, but I have a lot more experience than counsel of record on that case.
And you remember
in having arbitration awards vacated. But I would not be intellectually dishonest and say to the city, yeah, you got a good case, or as I think Mr. D'Amico mentioned, a slam dunk. There's no such thing in the law as a slam dunk.
As you bring up.
But there is case law that guides us, and there are really axiomatic, basic principles that we live by, one of which is pensions. It's a mandatory subject of bargaining. It can't be changed by legislative fiat on the local level. I share the frustration that some people have about that, both non-lawyers, citizens, and perhaps even some members of the council. But it has to be said. It's a mandatory subject of bargaining.
And as you remember, Mr. Augusta, because you read everything, I was here in 2012. We voted on it. It wasn't in the contract. We were told it was in municipal, and it was. We were told it was in police, and it was. We were told in fire, it wasn't. I actually voted against it.
Yep.
And they said that, hey, the similar situation, don't worry about the language. This is what it means. This is what it says. This is what our intent is. So I could have been, excuse me, I could have been Oliver Wendell Holmes that day and argued, hey, it's not in here. And people would have said, oh, well, you can look at past practices. You can look at something else. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to dot the I's and cross the T's. I mean, we have one situation here where the dates are wrong in the agreement. We'll get to that.
There are a lot of messy issues that have
in this
persisted.
Agreement.
Well, I take issue with that, but look, there are municipal collective bargaining agreements that are not paradigms of good draftsmanship. It can be daunting sometimes, but I will tell you this: the contract that's in front of you is light years better than the contract that has existed. I mean, look, your contract didn't have a management rights clause. Warwick had the distinction of having, and I say didn't have a management rights clause. It had one in name only. It said management rights. You know what the management rights clause was? It said you can promulgate rules and regulations of the department. It didn't speak to the organic rights of an employer to control the enterprise. You have that now. And as part of this deal, by the way, you also have the firefighters withdrawing proposals that would arguably impinge on management rights. And one other point that I want everybody to think about, because you can't hide the ball on this in terms of the evidence. And Mr. Penza, in the evidentiary phase of the arbitration, brought this out. In the 2012 and 2015 collective bargaining agreement and the 2015 to 2018 collective bargaining agreement, proposals were made by the city. Perhaps you weren't aware of it. Perhaps the administration, the prior administration, never informed the council. But proposals were made to contractualize changes that the council had passed. And those proposals were rejected by the union, and the city had an option at that time. And the city's option was, okay, if we really want to do this, and by the way, I think the fact that the city made those proposals is indicative of something. Perhaps someone at the time was thinking that the right way to do this is to propose the inclusion of ordinance reforms into the collective bargaining agreement. What did the city do? It obviously backed down. And, by the way, in the pending interest arbitration, there was another proposal to do the same thing. So when I say I share your pain, I understand, Mr. Marola, what you feel.
There were some situations where we didn't back down, where we didn't even know, where contracts were signed and paid out on and never brought to the council. So, you know, there's plenty of blame to share, but to say that this council was fully informed would be an outright lie. And one issue that you brought up regarding ordinances, and I would defer to our attorney on this, Mr. Harrington, can ordinances be amended by passing resolutions? For example, a resolution on a contract, does an ordinance have to be amended?
No, the ordinance needs to be amended. One of the issues here is that there's an existing ordinance that dates back to 2011. It's in effect. It hasn't been voided by any court. It was ignored by the arbitrator in the interest arbitration case, but it's still on the books. And as part of the material that's been brought forward here, there hasn't been anything brought forward to make any amendment to that ordinance. So the ordinance is still a valid law. Now, it may get challenged or be challenged in a court or voided in a court, but that hasn't happened yet.
And what I've said is that that ordinance may be simply precatory, a word that many lawyers know. It may be just precatory in effect. Again, I think I said, I understand the laudable goals that the council had back in 2011 to bring about pension reform. They passed the ordinance. That's a fact. You're right. It is in effect. The question is, what is the legal impact on that from a labor law perspective and a collective bargaining perspective? The arbitrator has ruled, and as I said, I think the case law in Rhode Island is quite clear about the mandatory nature of negotiating collective bargaining, the subject matter of pension in collective bargaining. And then once that's done, to the extent ordinances need to be enacted to be consistent, that's the follow-up.
So we pass laws that break ordinances and then fix the ordinances. That makes sense. Go ahead.
It's an odd construct. I don't disagree with you.
I would disagree. You amend an ordinance before you pass a resolution or a contract that's inconsistent with the law. But why would we want to put the cart before the horse? Because we did that last time and it didn't work. I thought we were underlining, as you said in your memo in the spring, you were underlining everything, you were highlighting everything, you were crossing through it. We're going to make sure that everything is, all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And that's the job of this council too, because we already went through it. So it's a process that needs to be fixed. And Mr. Augusta, can this council amend this agreement in any way?
No, after an agreement is executed?
No.
No, you execute a
Can we-
contract,
can-
it's a
can this
binding
co-
agreement.
A council pass amendments to this agreement?
Can a council, after an agreement is executed, pass an ordinance that somehow modifies a term or condition of employment?
That wasn't my question. Tonight, can we amend provisions within this ordinance? I mean, within this tentative agreement? Can we amend anything?
I don't believe you can, but I'll defer
That's-
to the solicitor.
No,
I
you're
don't-
right. You can't.
Okay.
You cannot.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Sir, did you want to speak?
Yes,
Just
please.
Identify yourself for the record.
Yes, Joseph F. Penza Jr., I'm the attorney for...
Speak into the mic, please.
The attorney for the Firefighters Union, Joseph F. Penza Jr. I just wanted to address, if I may, to the council president, a matter that he indicated that this would be a case of first impression. And I believe, Mr. Marola, you think because the Firefighters Arbitration Act came after the city charter had been passed, is that the basis of it?
I'm not here to advocate on behalf of our attorneys that are not here. I mean, the city, I'm not the attorneys for the city of Warwick. Somehow I get put in the position of being the attorneys. I would preferably have the attorneys that filed the litigation here to explain to us why they filed it and all the nuances of it. But I've articulated two reasons that I understand. One is that the pension ordinance came before the collective bargaining, and the second reason is procedurally, the union didn't act in a timely fashion pursuant to the contract.
Okay. Let me address the first point, because it would not be a case of first impression. It would be a case of fourth or fifth impression. The Rhode Island Supreme Court has, on at least 3 or 4 different occasions, have indicated that because pensions and other matters are mandatory subject of bargaining, notwithstanding what a charter may provide, the Firefighters Arbitration Act supersedes. And in the
It wasn't a charter, it was a state law that gave us that power.
Right. The state legislature gave you the power by virtue of putting it in your charter.
And that state law to this day hasn't been amended.
Right.
And there's been no cases interpreting that Warwick state law. Has there, Mr. Penza?
No Warwick. but
Okay.
I would assume that the Supreme Court would follow its teachings in the East Providence case that Mr. Ragasta referred to, where the city of East Providence had a state law in place that says it governs pensions. And then the Firefighters Arbitration Act came after that state law was passed, and when the case got before the Supreme Court said, Firefighters Arbitration Act supersedes. It's a mandatory subject of bargaining. We don't care what the state legislature did in 1923. So the case has already been decided. I understand you're not here to argue. I just wanted to make clear that it's not a case of first impression.
Did that case have a provision where the firefighters didn't exercise their rights pursuant to the contract for over 3 years? Is it a similar case?
That is not the case in East Providence, but you are well aware, or you should be aware of the facts in this case. If you read our memorandum and the arbitrator agreed, that was a situation where both parties agreed to hold the matter in abeyance, both sides, frequently done all the time in the labor world. So the fact that it was held in abeyance, Mayor Avedisian sent an email to the president of the Firefighters Association, upset because he had met on 58 different occasions to try to resolve this, to no resolution. Finally, when it couldn't be resolved, after we attempted to mediate it, we went to arbitration. There was no timetable involved in this situation. So, I mean, I just wanted to make clear that it's not a case of first impression.
You just did.
Thank you. Before we continue, I just want to make something clear from my perspective. It was said that this contract is much better than other contracts that have come before us over time. And that is true. And I don't think there's anyone here arguing that the contract before us has better inclusions in it than some of the previous contracts. particularly a contract that has a side deal that we don't know anything about. And when I think back to that contract and what I was told from the folks who were responsible for the contract, is very different when I find out that there's a side deal that we knew nothing about. So, because I agree that Mayor Solomon, his team, the firefighters have produced a contract that was better than the previous, that doesn't mean that I don't have the responsibility to look at not only what was redlined in this contract, but the other items in this contract that weren't addressed and weren't spoke to and weren't dealt with. I have that responsibility. I have that responsibility to the people and the taxpayers of the city of Warwick. And this is why we're having this debate. This is why this debate's going to continue, I have a feeling, for a little while. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. We're talking about a budget in this department of $24 million. I'm going to defer my additional comments and questions and ask Councilman Howe if you have anything that you would like to address in this, or questions.
Not at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Members of the council, do you have any questions or comments? I do. Council President?
Just one statement that was made earlier about Cranston and Providence, and Attorney Bliss was correct in his analysis that there was a financial crisis, if you will, or emergency. In both Cranston and Providence, the Rhode Island Supreme Court said that they could pass ordinances that impact collective bargaining agreements if there are financial emergencies, okay? And so, in particular, when you look at the situation that Warwick is in, it's too bad we don't have the actuaries come on the same night as contract ratifications, because it's helpful, because these are not numbers that are presented by any individuals. Those are presented by impartial third parties. And as you know, in September, it was $406 million for healthcare and a little over $450 million for pensions, unfunded liabilities. And I think the last time I saw our assets were around $160 million. It's great to pass provisions that have positive impacts, but not when the ship's going to go down anyway. And that's how I feel about this contract. You want to create more of a financial emergency than we have? I can recall having the first State of the City address in March, where Mayor Solomon outlined all these issues and the significance of all these issues. I mean, I grew up here. I went to school here, raised my family here. How anybody can look at these numbers objectively and say that we're not in a crisis situation is disingenuous. Our own actuaries said that we have to change the benefit structure. Not pass a benefit structure on OPEB that just looks at new retirees and a portion of what they're owed. I've talked to many of my constituents and received many telephone calls from my constituents. I've talked to members of the council and looked at these numbers and the concerns that they have. And the passing a contract like this, when, for example, at the state level, they don't have prescription drug caps. When at the state level, they don't have lifetime health care. Never mind funding 27% of lifetime health care. My thought, which I thought was extremely fair, was to look at what state employees get, what the teachers in the city of Warwick get for health care. Their unfunded liability, I think, is at $50 million. I wonder why, because they don't have lifetime health care. And to be fair and equitable across the board, I was at an event the other night with the former president of the union in Coventry. And he said to me, "You're right on, because this is what I was telling my members, and they didn't listen to me." And unfortunately, you know where we ended up. So keep saying what you're saying because you're telling the truth. So I look at what happened in Coventry, I look at what happened at Central Falls, and I wish that upon no one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to take the question from Councilman Qualley, and after that question, at the request of one of my colleagues, I'm going to call for a 5-minute recess. Councilman Qualley, you had your hand up a moment ago.
Yes, I have a question for Attorney Regasta. In 2015, prior to being on the City Council, the Council had the tentative agreement, which was with the firefighters from 2015 to 2018. So they had the outline of the memorandum of understanding of what the agreement was, and they had the information concerning what changes were going to be made, and that came before the council, and the council ratified it. It wasn't until 6 to 8 months later that an actual contract was written and signed by the mayor and by the firefighters and their union president. However, the written contract was not in the same form as the understanding that the city council had ratified. My question for you would be that if it were the version of the agreement that was ratified by the city council rather than the version that became the written contract, would that have had any effect on the litigation, either arbitration or what followed?
It's an interesting question, and I would say that your question in and of itself highlights the sloppiness of how labor relations have been conducted in this community. And when I say sloppiness, I say that with all due respect, because most of the communities that I've represented over the past 40 years, when a contract comes before a municipal body for ratification, the legislators on the city or town council get to actually see the contract. They see the contract that will be executed. And so they're ratifying the actual document that will become the labor agreement. Evidently, what happened in this community historically, and I don't know what the custom and practice had been or what the rationale was behind it, but you would get a synopsis, if you will, of what the substance of the collective bargaining agreement would include, and then presuming you ratified it, it was out of sight, out of mind, in the sense that you never actually laid eyes on an executed version of your contract. Now, I would presume it would be available to you as a public document. It's available on the website of the State Municipal Finance Office. But for whatever reason, this council did not ratify that 1518 agreement. You did.
That's correct. They
didn't
ratified the tentative agreement, the agreement that had been negotiated, that had all of the changes, just like we received tonight. However, they did not have the contract because it wasn't actually typed for several months. And at the end of the day, the wording of the contract was not the same as the agreement that they had ratified. Could you, I'd like to hear from Mr. Regasto.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, again, well, first of all, that time period of that agreement has expired. Basically, the agreement has been executed. The executory interval of the agreement was between 2015 and 2018. So the respective obligations of the city and the union were discharged with respect to the agreement that was signed. So your question would be, what would the legal impact be of the variance between the synopsis that you received?
Yes, whatever it was, the documents that were before the city council that they ratified, would that have had any change? Could that have changed the litigation?
It's speculation on my part, and as a brother attorney, I think you would probably appreciate this, that I could give you a prognostication, maybe, but it doesn't change the immutable fact that the subject matter of pensions had not been mandatorily negotiated between the union and the city. It had not been reduced to writing. It had not been a consummated, that subject matter was not a consummated agreement. And the best evidence of that is subsequent to the tentative agreement, or at some point when they were negotiating the 1518 agreement, there were, in the 1215 agreement, there were proposals to incorporate provisions of the ordinance into the collective bargaining agreement. But the negotiators or representatives of the city never followed through on that. I can't tell you with any degree of certainty what the impact of how the council was, dare I say, misled or not informed fully about what the status was between the collective bargain. I can't say what the impact would be, but it doesn't change the fact that the subject matter was never signed off between the union and the city. And I think that's the critical point.
Well, that is a critical point, and after I started here in January of 2017, I was trying to find the actual contract with the ink signatures by the signatories, and it was not in the city clerk office. It was not in the mayor's office. It wasn't in the office when Mayor Solomon took office, and it was not in personnel. And I still have not seen a signed copy of the 2015 to 2018 contract where it's signed and dated. And apparently the mayor in the past had gotten rid of the practice of using the mayoral seal that hadn't been used in, I was told, at least 10 years. But, so I don't know how that contract got typed in. I assume it was executed, even though I haven't seen a copy of that. And I just was asking whether it would have had an opinion, had any effect on the legal status of the case. And I'm just curious now if the council they did approve the outline of the changes. However, the contract that was put into practice has never come before the council, and they have never ratified that document. I was just kind of
I think
thinking about what would happen if we brought it back before us now and we were to reject it retroactively. What kind of a fallout that would be, because the council's never had the chance to act on it. I don't know if that's happened before. Might not. It might be something that President Marola can actually call a case of first impression, and we can see what happens.
Well, you certainly could, but let me speak from a practical labor relations and labor law perspective. That would create complete chaos, and I think that that would be disadvantageous to the firefighters, to the taxpayers, and the citizens, because that would propel more litigation. And I think what the city ought to be doing is learning from the mistakes of the past. I think one lesson that everybody has learned is there'll be much more attention paid to executing a collective bargaining agreement. I mean, if you think about it, you have a multi-million-dollar collective bargaining agreement, and this council never got to see it in years past. People go to real estate closings and purchase homes for much less money involved and spend more time executing documents than this municipality previously had been devoting to, shall we say, the formalities of executing a contract. So,
I agree with you.
Hard lesson learned.
100% on that. I notarize documents where I have people come to my office and have raised their hand to swear to tell the truth, that it is their signature, and it might be for something very simple, but it requires a notary. However, for documents that controlled millions of dollars in the city, it wasn't done. And I agree with you that litigation is, for the most part, very wasteful, that people should be able to agree. And one of the things that I'm not happy about this agreement is we still have left open the salaries for the last year's, the last year of that contract of 2015 to 2008, last fiscal year. That's what I mean.
Well, I would just say this, and I'm sure you've seen this and encountered this as an attorney in private practice. Oftentimes, disputes are resolved either in mediation or arbitration with so-called high-low or parameters that have been negotiated. And in essence, what happens is you funnel down the issues in dispute, and you bring about a little more certainty to the uncertainty of the end result. And I think Mr. D'Amico pretty much outlined, the financial impact of this range. So while you can't look at a particular number, we do know, based on Mr. D'Amico's assessment, that the fiscal impact of a resolution will be favorable to the city. And I should also add that the city, as a result of this settlement and this negotiated settlement with the firefighters, and I don't want to forget to add that they have been extremely professional. I've negotiated with firefighters of multiple generations, celebrating my 65th birthday today. So I negotiate with firefighters whose fathers and grandfathers were on the other side of the table with me. They've been professional, they've been reasonable, they've been practical. But they're not easy to negotiate with. But they have conducted themselves professionally. And I would say that to get the deal done, they had certain positions that they were fixed upon. And to get this deal done, we had to agree to at least leave it to the arbitrator to determine what that prior year of salary would be. But we've eliminated most of the risk, and I give them credit for that good faith bargaining. They withdrew everything. I don't have all the proposals in front of me, but once we start adding up all of those proposals, if they were to be granted by the majority of the panel, and keep in mind, I represent the city on the panel, but you have a neutral, and then you have a firefighter advocate. So there's a lot of exposure associated with that. It would be great if we could have agreed to that, but to get where we are today, that's the way the final deal shook out.
Well, I agree that both sides have been well represented in this stage of the labor negotiations, and perhaps in the recent past, 5 or 10 years ago, it wasn't the same type of representation. But I just wanted to ask you that question.
Thank you. And there's more
I
work
have
to
some
be
other,
done, by
Mr.
the
Chair,
way.
but for Mr. Bliss, but I'll wait.
Thank you, Councilman.
May I address one more
Excuse me, Mr. Regasta. So, to go to Councilman Corley's point, I think it is absolutely outrageous that the taxpayers got hoodwinked because of this side deal. And here we are, we're sitting here today, and we're hearing that the chances of winning in this arbitration are slim. Years ago,
Or nil.
I had an attorney say to me in a different venue I served in that I have a very impressive record. I have won about 95% of the cases I've taken on. I wasn't impressed. I'm a lot more impressed with somebody that takes on 100 cases and wins 50% of them than someone who takes on 20 cases and wins 95% of them. To sit here several years later, learning or hearing that this just, isn't going to happen and everything is fine is terribly upsetting. And from the taxpayers that I hear from, that's what I hear. One question before we go on to recess.
Let me just
Mr.
interject and say,
Sir.
I did not say everything is fine.
No, I didn't say you said it.
It would have been wonderful if this had been handled properly with sound advice back in 2011 and 2012, and the subject matter of pension reform was collectively bargained and negotiated. And it would have been fine if this council, as Councilman Corley just pointed out, actually had full contracts to read, and what they ratified were in fact transposed in an agreement. So I fully appreciate and empathize with your frustration over this.
And
hopefully
Mr.
we'll have a new
Regasta,
paradigm in terms of collective bargaining.
kudos to Mayor Solomon, who at the time was Councilman Solomon, I think back in 2008, brought the ratification of the contracts to the city council. And I'm sure that those feelings then haven't changed today, which is why we're having this ongoing conversation tonight. Now, you were part of the team, right, with this contract? That was what I believe was.
Well,
Mike is saying yes, you were.
Yes, for this contract, Mr. D'Amico, Solicitor Bliss, me, Chief DePasquale.
But you specifically, you were.
Oh, was I
Okay.
part of the team? Yes, but we collaborated, shall we say.
So in terms of, what things should say and what they don't say and what they haven't been included or things that are not definitive, things that are ambiguous, I have an email which you copied me on back in April of 2019. And it speaks to making a recommendation for future contracts. And that recommendation, in your words, were, finally, one simplistic suggestion to maintain the integrity of CBAs in the future is to add a clause beneath the signature lines of the union president and mayor to the effect of, in accordance with Ordinance Section 2-18A-C, this collective bargaining agreement has been duly ratified by the City Council on blah, 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 blah. The date, that clause should be signed by the council president and witnessed by the city clerk. Is there any reason why that wasn't put into this contract?
Well, since I didn't draft it, I can't speak to it, but I think that's easily added, and I don't think that that would be objectionable. I'd say either party, I don't think it would be objectionable whatsoever to the union or the city, but that's a good point.
But that's not something we can amend tonight. We can't amend this agreement to do that tonight.
Well, I think in the actual, obviously, the red line version is not going to be the signatory or the executed version of the agreement, but that certainly could be added, and if that was something that the council recommended, that's an easy addition to add to the signature lines.
With that said, it is now 7:26, and I will call a 5-minute recess. Please stick to the 5 minutes. Thank you. Let the record indicate it is now 7:37, and the Finance Committee is called back to order. Thank you, everyone. If you could all just take your seats, please. The acoustics in this chamber are less than favorable for people being able to hear what we're saying. So I have some questions with regard to the it's actually the document that we received from Brian, which stipulates the study has been performed based on the various parameters. It goes on to assumptions, specifications, et cetera. So that's going to be my questions. Is Brian, are you going to speak to that, or is Mike, or who? So Brian, in here, these are all your positions. The 6.9% investment return, that's the pension plan assumption. So you have those other items there as well. So with the 2% firefighter contribution, what is the total based on, we have two issues, I believe. One is a projection of 15 years in the OPEB, the other is 25 years. 15 years, we may agree, we may not agree. I don't think that the average retiree is only going to be collecting for a 15-year period. I understand that was used as an example, but 25 is probably the more probable. But in any event, what is the total contribution by the firefighter on that 2% over either the 15 or the 25-year period? Right. Is the mic on, Brian?
So that is going to be 2% of their pensionable earnings.
I understand that, but what is that total number at the end of the time period?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I was out of the room when you asked your question. Could you please repeat it?
So with the 2% contribution in the OPEB, we're talking about the OPEB.
Yes.
We have two different concepts here. One's 15, one's 25. So in the either one of those two, what is the total contribution by the employee?
So if you're looking for a hard dollar amount, the actuary won't give you one because, again, it depends on how many years that person works until they retire and at what pay grade they are when they retire. So instead of taking one person, what they do is they take the entire universe of potential future hires. And again, that would also depend on the date you hire them. Because if you don't hire a class for 7 or 8 more years, their salary 7 or 8 years from now, of which they would contribute 2%, would be much higher than today, meaning when they retire, the number is much bigger. So the way the actuary does their math is they say, given what I know about the cost of health care, and given the assumptions that I use to create my numbers, which get quoted often, to calculate the future cost of health care, and given what your salaries are today, if you hired somebody today and a certain percentage of people became captains, whatever the percentage has historically been, that same percentage. A certain percentage become lieutenants, a certain percentage leave service and never even vest in your pension, a certain percentage work 25 years, another percentage work 35, and we map that all out for the total population as a percentage of what the healthcare costs will be in the future. What percentage of costs will be covered by all of that money set aside? And again, you can't do any one person because you'd have to just pick which person, the captain, the lieutenant, which one, and they don't do that. They basically, again, they use the law of large numbers and they use your entire population, similar to what they do. They don't ever present to you in an actuary report what one person's health care is going to cost you in the future. They show you the entire population of OPEB. So their statement here is that in the future, by enacting this contract, anybody you hire in the future will pay approximately, I'm going to use the word approximately, but they put a hard number on here, will cover 30, based on all of those assumptions, they would cover 30% of their health care costs in retirement.
The answer is you don't know the answer.
The answer
I asked
is,
you, what is
no
the
answer.
firefighter's total contribution? Listen, Mike,
It's
you,
2% of their pay. How
Mike.
many years will the person work?
Go ahead, finish. When you're finished, then I'll continue. Go ahead.
If you want to know how much someone will contribute, if you tell me the date they are hired, at which date they will get a promotion, and at what date they will retire, I can calculate precisely for you what 2% is.
You calculated a fiscal note for us, and that fiscal note is based upon these assumptions and specifications.
Yes.
That's your fiscal note.
Yes.
So in order to get to those assumptions and specifications and calculations, you got to have an answer to the question. You have got to have done the math, because if you didn't do the math, you don't know the answer.
So
I'm not done.
Okay.
So what I'm asking you is, this is yours. This is your outline. Mike, let me finish.
I don't know what document you're holding up. I'm sorry.
What I have is the City of Warwick, Rhode Island. It has the City of Warwick provides medical coverage, et cetera, et cetera. The study has been performed based upon the various parameters. Those parameters are, all right, let's just read them all.
Right.
So, assumption specifications, 6.9% investment return, 3% salary increases, current estimate single premium, $800 a month. Healthcare inflation, 6% a year, projected premium, $4,595 per month. Tier 2 retirement eligibility, age 50 and 25 years. 2% of pay contribution per year. Then it goes on, sample, typical firefighter description. This is your stuff. This isn't my stuff. It says hired at age 25. And this is your spreadsheet to come out with that 30% average per year return, right? Average return over 20 years or 25 years, whatever the number was you said, is what not return. It's going to be effectively what their contribution is, right?
Yes.
Okay. An average of 30%.
Yes.
Okay. And you say hired at age 25, becomes a lieutenant at age 35, becomes a captain at age 45, retires at 55, right?
Yes.
Total pay levels for contributions. Firefighter currently average $72,800, lieutenant currently average $89,000, captains current average $98,000. This study has been performed based upon the parameters above and data provided by the City of Warwick.
Yes.
So, how do we not know what the 2% contribution is going to be at the end of your terms?
So first, I would like to point out that I did not prepare this document. It's signed
Who
by the
prepared
actuary.
it?
It's signed at the bottom by the city's actuary.
Okay, is the city actuary here?
He's not.
The city actuary is not here.
No.
So the person that did this design, did this layout, that you're telling me would have to answer the questions is not here.
You asked me what the exact dollar amount would be, And I answered you that when an actuary prepares even an OPEB report, which you study every year, they do not do it on an individual granular level.
What you
That
did
is not
was,
how they do their job.
and appropriately so, you corrected me, and thank you. And you said, I am not the one that prepared this document.
I am not.
The actuaries were. And I'm asking you if the actuaries are here to speak to this document, and they are not.
No.
So is there anyone else in this chamber that can speak to this document and how these numbers were supposed to? Mike, listen, the actuaries, they projected the numbers. They gave us this spreadsheet. They said, this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to happen, and at the end of this term, this is what we're going to save. I want to see the math. That's all I'm asking for. I want to see the math. How did you get to those numbers? And we're being told, I don't know. The actuaries aren't here to tell you.
I did not say that. You asked what one firefighter would have put aside, and
Okay.
I answered that
Okay,
that is
so
not
let's-
normally a question
all right, you don't
that
know.
your actuaries would ever answer for you
Okay.
because they deal in the law of large numbers, they deal in probabilities, because
Okay.
any one firefighter could pass away, could retire at a different age, and instead they use the universe of firefighters.
Right.
These are the assumptions they made. That is the conclusion they came to.
Well, I have my own resources that I've looked into to come up with the numbers. And based upon what the actuary's design is. Do you have any idea what the total OPEB return is going to be based upon this formula?
Excuse me, I'm not sure I understand the question. The OPEB return?
Yes.
What do you mean?
Your investment return, the actuaries, they're saying this is going to have a 6.9% investment return.
They are assuming.
What is that number?
They assuming the same return in the pension plan. And again, they do not put dollar amounts here because they do not know the date at which you will hire these people.
So we don't know what the number is.
We don't know
Okay.
the specific dollar amount. No, we don't.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just one quick question. You can tell us what the savings are, but you can't tell us any numbers in between.
I can tell you what it would be a percentage of, as a percentage of your healthcare costs. If your healthcare costs are 100 million, this
Michael,
will save 30. If they're 200, this will save 60.
You made assumptions. And you gave us a number at the end, but you can't give us any of the numbers in between. I get it. You answered the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So to go back to this, because you are, I'm just generalizing, let's just clear the air so I don't have to keep repeating the actuary.
Yeah.
So you're generalizing and you're projecting that in this OPEB trust,
Yes.
it's going to have, it's going to be the equivalent of a 30% copay, if you will, over this time.
Yes.
That's what you said.
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
How did you get to that number?
Again, I gave the actuaries the parameters based, I didn't give them the assumptions. They generate their own assumptions. I did not tell them what rate of return to assume. That's based on your pension plan's assumption. I did not tell them what to assume for healthcare inflation. That's in their purview, not mine. All that we provided them with was current average salary data and what the provisions are of your retirement to give them an idea of how to estimate how many years it would take someone to retire.
Okay.
From that, they generated this report. That's
So, this is, I don't get how come this actuary isn't here tonight. This is a significant portion of what we're talking about. And this isn't for me. I don't benefit by this. They benefit by this. And what we're hearing is we don't know what the number is that they're going to be putting in out of their pocket. We don't know. So let me read you some of the numbers. Let me read you some of the numbers that I've come up with based upon this information that's on this sheet right now.
okay.
So you said an average of a 30% return, right? What is it?
I said
what is it? What's the 30%?
6.9% investment return.
It's what, please?
6.9% investment return?
No. On the 2% copay, sorry. You said that's going to average out over time at 30%.
Matter
of fact, it says it right
what
here.
the actuary
Are
says is-
projected to offset gross retiree health costs by an average of about 30% per year.
In retirement, yes. That is not a return. That's not an investment return.
I get it. I understand. We're talking about, we're going between the pension and return and this. I understand. I'm sorry. So the 30%, we're focusing on the 30% right now, average.
Yes.
How did you get to that?
Again, we gave the actuary the data on how much a Warwick firefighter makes. We gave the actuary the data on what the Tier 2 pension states in terms of how many years they have to work. They generated their own assumptions that did not come from the city of how long a firefighter will work before retirement, because they will work a varying number of years. They use their own standard assumptions on healthcare increase and investment returns that are in your OPEB reports. They use the same assumptions to create the OPEB report, and they said this would be a 30% reduction.
Okay, got it.
Perhaps a better way to look at this is if I said, had this been in place 30 years ago, your OPEB liability today would be 30% lower than it is. That's
Sure.
maybe a better way to look at it.
And I don't disagree with that. That's why two of us introduced the healthcare ordinance just recently. Because if we would have did that 25, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be sitting here either. So based upon these guidelines right here,
Yes.
a 2% return on a firefighter over a 25-year period, that's what they said, over a 25-year period, is going to generate $84,697. That's what the firefighter is going to be putting in up to the time they retire.
Did
Then-
you see that number on here?
Excuse me?
Did you see that number on here, 84?
No, I didn't. These are numbers that I'm running based upon these calculations. It's
Okay.
your calculations, it's your formulas.
I understand that, but a captain that makes $100,000 today,
A day?
that makes $100,000 today,
Oh,
20
today.
years from now, is going to be making far in excess of $100,000. So whereas today,
Right.
that captain might put away $2,000, years from now, that $2,000 will be much larger. So if I just assume 2,000 times 25 years, that's 50,000. Now, we know it'll be bigger than that because they'll be getting raises. There's also a 6.9% investment return on that money each year because it will be invested. So I don't know how you arrived at your calculations, but it seems like something is missing.
I agree. I agree. And you don't have the answer. So I assume you
I would
also don't have the answer for...
Did anyone on the council, many members of the council sent either questions by email on things they were unclear on, or they called me or came to my office or saw the chief of staff. Did you ever at any time ask anyone in the mayor's office to ask the actuary how much this might be for an individual firefighter, or did you just wait till tonight?
No, I didn't, because of the countless amount of hours I've had to put into this document where these things are not clear and you got to keep looking for them. So no, I haven't.
Had you asked, I would have been happy to provide the answer weeks ago when we provided the document.
So we're here asking us to vote on something tonight that we don't have the answers on.
Well, it sounds like you've
Okay.
had this question for a while.
Okay.
And chose not to ask the question.
Do you have the total pre-65 healthcare costs? Do you have what that total is?
For whom?
For the employee.
For an individual
this
employee or for the entire
No,
fire
for this
department?
employee, for one employee.
Today, let me
Over
refer to my
this
notes.
time frame,
Over an entire time frame? Again,
through retirement.
it's going to depend on the date you hire the employee and how many years he works until retirement.
And this return, this 2%, because obviously we don't have the numbers. So this 2% that the firefighters are going to be contributing to this OPEB fund, it's going to have a certain value over time. It's going to have a number which the employee contributed to the OPEB plan, and it's going to have a number that the taxpayers are paying for. Correct?
Well, the taxpayers will not
And the
contribute
cost
to
of the
the
health care.
OPEB.
And the cost of the health care.
The taxpayer would pay the other 70%.
Okay.
That is correct.
The other what?
The other 70%. Yes, that's right.
Or more.
or less.
Correct. And at the end of their retirement, they pass away. What happens to the money that's in that account, which is both the employee contribution as well as the investment return? What happens to that?
Per the provision of the contract, the money that is in that account is meant for that employee's health care costs in retirement, and solely for that employee's health care costs in retirement. So if that employee passes away, and it's very clearly written in the contract, any money that is left in that account would go to that employee's estate.
That goes to the employee's estate?
Yes.
Including, so how does that work? How does that offset any expenses then?
It offsets expenses for the years with which they are using the city's healthcare in retirement. Once
Okay.
they're no longer using the city's healthcare,
Right.
they're not causing the city to incur any expense on their behalf any longer.
So the investment return on that account, it doesn't stay there, it gets dispersed to their estate.
Any money that was allocated for that employee that they put money in and earned a return on, yes, you're absolutely right. At the date of their death, it goes to their estate. And that's assumed in these calculations. The actuary has made that assumption that certain employees will pass away at different times of life. And so, again, the average will be 30%. Certain employees will end up contributing more. Certain employees will end up contributing less than 30%, depending on their exact nature of their career and how long they live.
But based upon this information from the actuaries, your understanding is that this being an average scenario, the average scenario is the employee will be contributing about 30% of the
Yes.
cost of health care, average per year.
Yes.
So from year 1 to year 25, that's going to average out 30%.
It will not be
Average.
precisely 30%
No,
every year.
yeah.
It will average out to 30%, yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
just have a quick question for Michael. Michael, were you here when the actuaries came in September?
I was not at the council meeting that evening, no.
Okay. So when the actuaries came, they mentioned that our annual required contribution the year before was $23 million a year. And as you know, with a maximum tax increase, the city of Warwick can raise about $8.3 million a year. Do you know that?
Yes.
Okay. And you'll also recall, because you probably read the actuarial report, that number went from 23 million to over 34 million annual required contribution per year. You know that?
I'm familiar with
With
it,
a
yes.
maximum tax increase of 8.3.
Yes.
Okay. So even if we could raise the taxes 3 times, you couldn't pay for an annual required contribution. We're not paying an annual required contribution now, are we?
No, you're not.
Okay. And so this contract does not address that issue of current employees.
That's correct.
Right. So when that reaches the point where we can't tax or cut or borrow, that's when you run into a Providence situation or a Cranston situation, right? Where you can't pay your bills, you got a financial crisis.
I would, as a finance professional, I would argue, and this requires a much longer and different venue and conversation.
I
would
bet it
argue
does.
that it is not in the best interests of the city or the taxpayers to contribute the annual required contribution to your OPEB, and I would welcome the chance to have that discussion.
Maybe we should stop contributing to their pensions while we're at
That
it
is
too.
not the same thing. A
Thank you,
pension
Mr. Chairman.
is not the same thing.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Mike, this, with again, respect to the OPEB portion of this, because for the most part, actually for the entire part of the 2%, that's their monies.
Yes.
So this is a 3-year contract,
Yes.
correct? And we know contracts change. They change every 3 years. So what happens in a future contract if that were to be moved out, and we're not doing this OPEB thing anymore, how does these projections, that you're looking for us to approve tonight, how do they all play out?
I would say it would play out the same as any projections you get on pension and health care. They are accurate on the day you're given them based on all the information on that date. If you make a contractual change of any nature, if tomorrow the firefighters agreed not to have a pension anymore, there'd be a massive change in your pension obligation projections, and you would get a fiscal note explaining it. If tomorrow the city and the council and the firefighters agree to double their pension. So hypothetically, if it were to change, you would need a new note from the actuary of the impact of that. But that's true of anything in a contract. That's true of anything.
I understand, but the point is that if it does change, the presentation that we're hearing today about why it's being done in the first place is gone.
As with any provision of a contract, yes.
This is also based on new hires, correct?
That's right.
This is for new hires.
That's right.
So it doesn't impact the current employees.
That's correct.
So when this analysis was done, what was used for a projection for new hires? Where did that come from?
Again,
based upon, so how did you project out the success of this plan over 15 or 25 years that was going to generate a 30% average per year contribution on health care based upon new hires? So
and
what's
again,
new hires?
this is why it's percentages and not hard dollar amounts, because percentages don't change based on the year you hire somebody, but the hard dollar amount does, because you have a different starting point. However, whether you hire somebody 15 years from now, or 2 years from now, or 30 years from now, again, as you rightly point out, I can't tell you exactly how much money they will have set aside because I don't know what their starting salary will be on that date, and I can't tell you exactly how much their health care would be in retirement because I don't have their starting date and therefore the year they would retire. But I can tell you no matter what year, that when you project out these assumptions, no matter what year you hire that person, it results in approximately 30% of their health care. That's why it's a percentage, for exactly that reason, because we can't specify the date you're going to hire the person, and we did not try.
And if this plan were to be implemented, who's going to be, who's the administrator for this? Who's going to be administrating or watching over this OPEB plan?
The plan is for the pension administrator to also administer this and to invest the funds in essentially the same way.
The pension administrator?
Yes.
Okay. And they're going to be determining what investments are being made on behalf of the firefighters?
The pension board would be determining. Essentially, this was designed to mimic the pension plan in terms of how the money is tracked, how the money is managed, and how the money is invested. And that's why they use the pension plan assumptions, because they should move together.
So, but this is a separate plan.
It is a separate plan.
This isn't a pension plan. It's not 20% of the copay.
No,
this is a separate plan that they're paying into.
That's correct.
And they're paying in 2%.
Yes.
And the administrator is going to be whoever's managing the pensions.
It will be managed the same as the pension.
And they're going to determine how their monies are being invested.
Similar to the pension, yes.
But it's different.
Well, they make a pension contribution out of their paycheck, and that money is invested along with the city's pension contribution. In this case, the city's not making a contribution, but the investment will be the same.
So how is this going to be accounted for in terms of the budget, and will the employees be getting a report from the administrators as to what's happening with their pension plan?
Well,
I'm sorry, with their
OPEB
2%.
plan. So we have had no discussions with the fire union about any type of annual reporting for the employees. I'm sure once you set up the plan, that is something that could be discussed if an employee wants an annual report of how much is in their plan. That level of detail would not be appropriate in a collective bargaining agreement. We have agreed the concept of how this would work, how much money they would put aside. The detail of what report an employee would get is really not subject of collective bargaining. That is something that would get agreed between the city and the union, what reporting that they would provide on an annual basis.
And who's paying for this? For the actuaries, the investors, et cetera, the documentation, the reporting that will take place at some point in the future. Who's paying for that?
Well, given that this will be managed by the same people managing your pension plan, it's just simply another influx of funds. It's invested the same way. You already send them money every month. So there would be no increased cost. There will be some record-keeping costs. I imagine they are pretty minor, and there has been no discussion of who would pay, but given that you're already keeping track of someone's pension contributions each year, everything's already set up. I can't imagine there'd be an increased cost of it. Now that I think about it, all of that documentation is already in place. You already keep track of how much someone contributes to their pension every year. Now you'll be keeping track of what they contribute to their OPEB every year, but the mechanism has already been designed by the city. And there's already a firm that does this for you.
So they're going to take on extra work of X amount of employees, which over time is going to amass, assuming this continues to stay, a significant amount of monies. They're going to manage all of that for free.
They already manage all of your money.
Okay. So that's the answer. They're going to be doing it for free.
They will do it for this under the same contract they have today. Today, if tomorrow the city sent an extra $50 million to fund the pension plan, they wouldn't ask for any extra money to do that. This is the same thing. You will send them additional money.
And
It will be invested in the same way as the pension plan.
the fees that they charge us now, that's something that is done through a bid process?
I don't know anything about that. Is well beyond
Brian,
my
do you know?
knowledge with the city.
Is the folks that invest in the pensions and oversee the pensions, et cetera, those people that are at the pension board with us,
Yes.
how do they get paid?
There are different fee schedules for each of the investment managers.
Okay. So they're all under different fee schedules.
Correct.
And there's criteria for what they do,
Yes.
how much they invest.
Correct.
The rate, the returns, et cetera, excuse me, and the returns, et cetera, et cetera. That's how they get paid.
Correct.
Okay.
If I could follow up on that.
Sure.
As part of the 6.9% investment return that the pension plan assumes, that return is net of fees, meaning the fees that the city has to pay the manager are already baked into there.
Okay.
Meaning also, the fees that the city would have to pay the manager for this OPEB account are therefore also already baked into there because we use the same number. So there are no additional fees. It's all covered in the calculation.
And the assumption is that this 6.9% investment return is going to basically remain fixed.
That's your pension plan return, and the actuary is obligated to use the same one. I mean, they can't
Sure.
just pick one. That's what the city has prescribed as its investment return for its pension assumptions.
Right.
We were obligated to use the same number.
Right. No, I'm asking that, Mike, because I can remember years ago when the assumption was 8%, and everybody that was on this city council then was kicking and screaming that that number was ridiculous. And then because of the pressure from the council, that got reduced down to 7.5%, and then eventually it came down to 6.9%, and who knows where it's going to end up after. So on the OPEB account, so X dollars and cents come in for a firefighter. Firefighter retires. There's X amount of dollars in the account. What happens if in year 3 that money is completely drawn out? What happens with any additional costs incurred? Does that
You mean
go
in
back to the
their
taxpayers?
third year of retirement?
Yeah, and the healthcare costs.
Okay.
Yes.
So that really can't happen. The way the way the agreement was designed is that the actuary, on the date of someone's retirement, when they calculate their pension, they will also calculate how much is in their OPEB account. They will make an estimate of how long that person will live, and they will take the total in the account and divide it by the number of years they expect that person to live. That's how much will get drawn out of the account each year toward their cost. And it's that number that is estimated to be 30%. But you couldn't run out of money in 3 years because you're taking out a fixed amount each year based on this person's lifespan. Now, if somebody lives longer than expected, there will also continue to be returns in that account. So the money should last longer than the actuary's original assumption. If they pass away sooner, then there will be money left in the account. But it's impossible, based on the way it was constructed, for there to be no money after only 3 years. And if somebody retires at 55, I would imagine that the actuary will estimate that they would live 20 to 25 years, and therefore they will do the math such that there will be enough money for at least that many years. But you don't have to worry about the money being gone after 3 years. The way it was constructed, that can't happen.
Okay, thank you. In Article 2, on page 6, in the red line, it speaks to those that have been, let me read the whole paragraph. Vacancies in private ranks shall be anticipated so that the division of training can have a pool of recruits from which these vacancies can be filled in the sole discretion of the city. This is new language. Once the recruits have been sworn in as members of the department, employees who have not been assigned to a position, i.e., those who have been sworn but then laid off, will be part of a so-called surplus pool. Employees in this surplus pool may be detailed to companies where manpower is short due to sickness, injuries, and/or vacancies, provided, however, employees in the surplus pool may not be used to fill the aforementioned vacancies when permanent members of the department are available and willing to fill in. So, Tim, could you clarify that? Is there potential for new firefighters that are sworn in to be laid off? Yes or no?
And, excuse me, which page is this?
I'm
that
sorry,
you're
on page 6. It's in the red lined item. Page 6, it's the last paragraph.
Oh, in Exhibit A.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just assumed that.
Yeah,
I
the
realized that.
red-lined agreement is
Yeah,
Exhibit
okay.
B. And your question is?
In the last paragraph, it speaks to those that have been sworn in but then laid off. So my question is, what's the possibility of that occurring? So there's firefighters been trained, they're sworn in, and then get laid off. This says there's a potential to be laid off and could be, used as a surplus pool.
Right.
Okay. So what happens to the FUTA rate on those layoffs? Has that been calculated into the expense or cost savings that's included in this fiscal note? Has that been included in the fiscal note, is my question.
Well, I think Brian or Michael might be the one to speak what's been included in the fiscal note.
So we certainly included in all our calculations all FICA, unemployment, all of that. We did not make an assumption that there would be a layoff, and I certainly don't expect there to be a layoff of firefighters. So maybe I misunderstood your question.
No, you didn't.
Okay.
It's in the language. It's right here in the red line version. It says, recruits that have been sworn in as members of the department, employees who have not been assigned to a position, i.e., those who have been sworn in but then laid off, will be part of a so-called surplus pool. We had that not that long ago where we had, I think it was 8 or 9 firefighters that were put into like a reserve kind of
Right.
thing, right?
So,
Floaters, they were called. They were called floaters.
So the fiscal calculations were all based on your current employees. That provision would relate to any new hires. Now, similar to, you'll note in the contract, we have an agreement that new hires will stay at the lowest rate of pay for 2 years instead of 1, and then the next lowest rate of pay for 2 more years instead of 1. We did not calculate any savings from that because you have not hired those people yet. It will save you money when you hire them. They are not here today. So there's no fiscal impact of that today because they're not here. Same with this. There is no fiscal impact because you have not hired them today, and there's also no saying, it's not a certainty that you would hire more than you need and lay off the excess. It would certainly be within the city's rights to hire only exactly what they need and not lay anyone off at all.
I'm asking the question based upon what's in here. I didn't make this up. I'm asking the question based upon what's in here. I understand if you don't hire anybody, this is a moot point. What it says is if there is, and if there's extra, they're going to go into a so-called surplus pool, or they will be laid off. I'm asking if the cost of the FUTA rate, which the more folks, when you have, obviously you know, when you have folks that are laid off, it's the employer who pays the FUTA rate. The employee doesn't pay that.
Yes.
And that cost can rise significantly as you incur more and more layoffs.
Yes.
And that is a percentage of formula. So I'm asking, do you have any knowledge or do you anticipate any layoffs based upon what it says here? And have you factored in the possibility that may occur? And if it does occur, what's the effect on the FUTA rate?
Again, similar to, we did not factor in what the savings would be from those new hires at the lower payroll. We did not also calculate what potential layoffs might be of potential new hires at some point in the future, nor would you ever include that in a fiscal note.
So on page 11, again in the same Amendment A for right now, the hours, we already spoke about that. But it says here, the aforementioned Boston schedule will be used on a one-year trial basis commencing January 1st, 2020 and ending December 31st. The city may elect to opt out of Boston schedule and revert to previous 4-platoon schedule by giving written notice to the union on or before November 1st, 2020. The city may elect to opt out of the Boston schedule upon showing that the Boston schedule has resulted in an increased cost that cannot be attributable in substantial part to other factors, i.e. Decrease in overall department staffing causes increased overtime costs. If an election is made by the city to opt out of the Boston schedule, then in order to afford members with a transitional period, the Boston schedule will remain in effect until June 30th, 2021, after which the previous 4-platoon system work schedule set forth will, in A-1, will be reinstated. So essentially, if this plan were to be implemented, it's technically we're talking a year and a half, not a year, right?
The firefighters would work the Boston schedule for essentially a year and a half.
Year and a
correct?
half.
And that specifically because the firefighters will have significant rearranging of their lives, so to speak, in order to switch from working their current schedule to the 24-hour schedule. So this gives them some time in the event the city elects to go back to reorder their lives to go back to the old way of doing things.
Okay. So it also says if the city does not opt out of the Boston schedule as set forth above, then that schedule shall become a permanent part of collective bargaining agreement, subject to be revised only in accordance with the Firefighters Arbitration Act. So if this were to be approved in its current form, and this were to go through, let's say, the test period, this essentially locks the management of the city in perpetuity to this agreement. Is that right? Based upon, let me just preface this, say this, Tim. Based upon the conversations that we just had earlier, that a city ordinance doesn't trump a contract. So what this says is this will remain a permanent part of a bargaining agreement subject to be revised only in accordance with the Firefighter Arbitration Act. What this does is it locks in this mayor, future mayors, this council, and future councils to ever change this particular language unless it's agreed to in contract negotiations. Is that correct?
It doesn't lock the city in more than any other provision of this agreement. It functions exactly the same
Oh.
way as any other provision of the agreement.
So are you saying that by ordinance, the council could change this?
No, I'm saying,
How can it
as
be
we've been
changed?
saying all night, exactly the opposite is
Right.
true. But I'm saying that's true of every provision in this agreement. The city's not free to change it by ordinance.
I understand that, but this is a new provision in the agreement. As I
Correct.
said earlier, so my responsibility is to look at, analyze, and make judgment on the proposed new language. This is a contract ratification. I'm not here to ratify just the proposed changes. I'm here to look at this contract and say, do I want to ratify anything else that's in this contract? Or do I want to have a say on things that I think perhaps might be included or taken out? Now, we know that's only a suggestion. We know we can't do that here in this forum, but that's part of this conversation. This is new language, and this language includes another provision in this agreement that says it cannot be changed unless it's done through the Firefighters Arbitration Act.
Correct.
So
That's
this can't be
negotiation.
changed.
That's
So you
and-
buy it, you own it forever.
Well, no, not you own it forever.
Oh.
It's subject to negotiation. The exact same thing could be said for the
Right.
OPEB trust that we just discussed.
I understand.
If the firefighters decide that they don't like it, it can't be taken out of the agreement except
Right.
through negotiations. It works the
But
same
the
for both
legislative
parties.
branch of government has nothing to say about it until a change is negotiated between the executive branch and the bargaining group, and then it comes back before us.
Correct, and
Okay.
then you have the opportunity to ratify the agreement that's
Right.
brought to you, or reject the agreement.
So in this, in Article 6, it says there exists a voluntary vacation accrual system whereby employees have banked vacation days. Henceforth, commencing with the year 2002, vacation days and going forward, no further accrual of vacation days shall be allowed. Employees who have banked vacation days may choose to use them in the following manner. And those are all things that I know that at the time, Councilman Solomon, then became Mayor Solomon, addressed part of that issue, or if not the issue, in June. So is there a list of who these employees are that have banked vacation days and what they are, et cetera?
There is a list. I'm not even sure to the extent any employees have these days left. I'm sure somebody from the union could speak to that, but I believe that at this point, there may be no days left. But, all right, I mean, I'm glad you brought up this provision, because if you skip down to subsection 2, you'll see this is another important provision. We talked about, I think many of us have talked about some of the undoing the mistakes that have happened in the past, and I think this is an excellent example of this, potentially the most important of the mysterious change that occurred in the last collective bargaining agreement, where the value of a day was changed from 1/5 to 1/4, and there was a dispute over that, and the city could have tried to fight it in litigation. It's not clear how the change got made, and we have put it's clear. If this agreement gets ratified, it goes back to 1/5.
And Tim, that is very important, and it was certainly a mile marker for Mayor Solomon and the team to do that. But this is also the reasons why we're having all of these other conversations earlier on about what's ambiguous and what's not clear and what's not defined, et cetera, et cetera. And we've already discussed a half a dozen of those things. And that's the reason, because of this was a side deal that was done. Nobody on the council knew about it. As a matter of fact, as was pointed out by Councilman Qualley, council never even ratified that. So that wasn't even perhaps a contract that was ratified. But that is an important issue.
Absolutely, but what I can say definitively, we can debate all night, and I'm not suggesting that it's not valuable to debate these things about ambiguities. What I can say with absolute certainty is there are no side agreements with this contract.
Nor am I suggesting there are.
And that's
Let me
why,
make
and I'm
that
not
perfectly
suggesting
clear.
you are. I just want to be very clear that this team absolutely insisted that you get Exhibit B
Mm-hmm.
to the tentative agreement, which is the complete red lines agreement, and it says no other agreements. This contract is it. There are no side agreements, and to the extent there were, they're wiped out by this agreement.
And I'll repeat, and I'm quite positive, none of my colleagues are suggesting that. But if something isn't clear, and it isn't defined in here, so what's wrong with discussing that? What's wrong with bringing that up? And what's wrong with correcting it?
Absolutely
This isn't like, I mean, I've made mistakes. We've all made mistakes. But they just need to be corrected. That's all, so we don't end up in some issue later on. On the holidays, I know that we spoke about, there was a holiday that was given up. I see on here, Easter Sunday is a holiday. It's a paid holiday. Are there any other bargaining groups or employees in the city that get Easter Sunday as a paid holiday? I'm just curious.
I believe they all do. I mean, it's a fairly, I can't speak to every, I don't have every city contract in front of me. I
I'm
can
just
say
curious
that's-
because I've had other folks ask me about that, so
I can say it's very
I'm just
common
looking for the
throughout the
answer.
state that firefighter bargaining units all have, that I'm aware of, have Easter Sunday. I believe the police do.
That's to confirm. The police do have Easter Sunday.
okay. So it's police and fire that have that.
I believe that was done in 1991.
So if I could, right now, I'd like to defer to our council solicitor. John, could you speak to your comments that you have provided everyone on this council? Could you go through those for us?
Can, but some of them have already been covered. But the ones
Okay.
that haven't been covered, I can quickly go through them. Okay. The first one that I thought had maybe some significance, and I called you about it last week, Tim, is in Article 2, Section 2F, and in Article 2, Section 6F. There's language being stricken from the contract that I looked at. It's not part of, it wasn't dealt with in the fiscal note, but in a prior lifetime, I was the labor attorney for the city back in the 80s and the 90s. That language addresses the filling of vacancies when the staffing on the department is above minimum manning in any shift, and it allowed for the use of the more senior person on the shift rather than calling back rank for rank in the higher ranks of captain and battalion chief. It was negotiated into the contract by the city at the time in an attempt to address overtime. And I called you at the end of last week wondering what and why it was those two sections were being deleted.
Yes, and I said at the time that I did not believe that the removal of these provisions would create any additional overtime liability on the part of the city. I did speak to the chief. I told you prior to that, prior to you and I speaking, and I did speak with him again, and he confirmed that the operational flexibility, that the removal of these provisions allows him, he believes, is certainly a benefit to the operations, and nothing in the agreement prevents the city from doing exactly what those provisions required it to do. It just removes the handcuffs from the city to obligate it to operate in a certain way.
Okay, except I'll just offer the comment that at the time when the city negotiated the language into the contract, it wasn't viewed as a handcuff on the city. It was viewed giving management some flexibility to use the staffing that it was on a platoon when it was above minimum manning for filling a vacancy in the officer ranks. So there's obviously a different viewpoint going on right now, but when it was negotiated in, that was the perspective, that it wasn't a handcuff.
It's also, as we discussed, it's a little bit of an academic discussion in the sense that the department hasn't been operating at above minimum manning in quite some time.
I agree with you that if it's below minimum manning, the provisions don't come into effect at all. They only come into effect if it's above minimum manning. I already addressed the, I just quickly go over it, the change in the work schedule and then the language, which talks in terms of shifts, and the vacation and sick days that talks in terms of days. Some of the other comments on here have already been addressed by the council person. The last one was some dates that are in the agreement. Do you have, you need Exhibit A.
I do have Exhibit A. I
Okay.
also have Exhibit B.
On page 26 of Exhibit A,
Yes.
in Section 1, it talks about the effective dates for Tier 1 and Tier 2. The Tier 2 for all members who are hired on or after July 1, 2019.
Correct.
All right. If you go to I have too much paper. Part C, Section 1.
Part C of,
A couple of pages later,
okay.
of those provisions on the pension.
Which page are you on?
Um,
Oh, I see. Yes, I see. Yeah.
In those sections, it says the effective date for Tier 2 is June 30, 2018. The year is different.
Okay.
So there's an inconsistency of the dates of when the hiring would take place. Now, I don't know if there's been any hiring.
Yeah, I believe that's a typo, and as a scrivener's error, as you know, that could be fixed. However, I think it's probably a moot point, because I'm not sure there were any new hires since July 1st, 2018 anyway. There weren't, so it wouldn't become an issue.
Okay.
It couldn't become an issue.
If there's been no new hires,
Could
it's
not,
an issue.
correct. But the errors noted and certainly can be corrected.
What'd you say about the errors?
I said the error, the Scrivener's error is noted and certainly can be corrected, but since it can't become an issue because there have been no new hires, I'm sure there's no, the union would have no issue with correcting it.
And I think we said at the beginning of the hearing, we can't amend anything. This council can't amend mistakes.
I'm not sure that was exactly the statement. I think substantively the document can't be amended because the union has already ratified it. A Scrivener's error is a different matter, I would certainly contend.
Which I disagree with. I mean, we can't pass contracts that have provisions in them that are inaccurate.
But again, that date is not inaccurate. If the contract was passed with the dates as they are, because there were no new hires, it's irrelevant. There could be no grievance filed over it. There would be no possibility of it.
Council President, you have anything else? No. Councilman McAllister.
I move that we open to get public comments on this, as the council will still have another opportunity after when we move to the full floor on this. So I move that we open to get public comments.
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Members of the public who would like to speak on this matter? Sir, identify yourself for the record.
Good evening. My name is Ken Block. I'm a business owner in Warwick, a taxpayer. You guys covered a lot of ground tonight, and I'm appreciative for all of the information that's come out. I'm especially appreciative for the new process that we're following. It's refreshing to have a contract to digest before you're supposed to vote on it, and for the public to also take a look at. For that, I'm very thankful. One of the most important things that I saw tonight and that I heard tonight, as a business owner and someone who negotiates my own contracts, is the ambiguity that was discussed in the contract, and frankly, that was one of my talking points that I meant to bring up here to you tonight, was the ambiguity directly related to the definition of days, sick days, vacation days, etc. We have certainly learned over time that ambiguities in these contracts can be deadly, and we have a unique opportunity here to not make a mistake that will impact us in the future. And what I would urge everybody to do, and certainly what I do in my own business, when there's a clause that I don't like and that's unclear, and especially when I have agreement from the other side that we can make that better, you make it better. You don't rush a contract through simply because you're feeling some pressure of some sort for time. The decision that you make here today, if you choose to ratify the language as it exists today, will set up some sort of potential problem in the future, and it doesn't have to. We should take the time, you should make the changes and ensure that the language is as tight as it can possibly be. That's just common sense contracting, and your role in the Warwick City Council is you are not a rubber stamp. You are the only tool that the public has to protect our interests. You're it. There is no other ability. The contract is negotiated away from public view, and it only arises and comes out in front of you right now. If you don't act to protect our interests in terms of strengthening the contract language and ensuring there's no mistakes in there, no one else can do it. If I allow a contract that I negotiate to go through with ambiguous language and I know it, shame on me. If you allow a contract to go through with ambiguous knowledge, shame on you, and you've let all of us down. So let's fix that. It's a common sense thing to do. It's the right thing to do. Another quick comment on something that I found very interesting was the discussion about the 1.5% versus the 3%. And the savings, which we learned would go higher if the 3% is what comes out of the arbitrator's decision as opposed to 1.5. And just a funny story reminds me of a conversation I had with my wife, who, on hearing there was a sale, said, oh, let's go buy 3 times as much stuff as we would normally buy. Look how much more money we're going to save. Well, there's a cost associated with the 1.5% versus the 3%. And any small savings that we realize with a couple of days that are given back are overwhelmed by the increase in the 1.5 to the 3%. And I just didn't hear anybody really acknowledge that, and I wanted to make sure that that was brought up here tonight. 3% as opposed to 1.5% is a gigantic hit to the taxpayers no matter which way you slice and dice it. And any small incremental savings on the value of giving back sick days or vacation days is pennies on the dollar relative to the overall cost. We heard the mayor's chief of staff tell us of an epic saga of heroic negotiating and arriving at a contract that is good for everybody. I want to tell you a slightly different story. I want to tell you a tragedy. I want to talk about a year and a half ago, I came before this council and we dissected and discovered the side deal. We understood the math behind the secret side deal where unused sick day dollars were being taken at a rate far beyond what the contract that you ratified allowed to be done. That was extra legal. You didn't allocate those monies, but those monies were taken in a side deal that was negotiated between the fire chief at the time, who was the former union president, and the existing union president at the time, and it was witnessed by the city solicitor. You should be extraordinarily skeptical on anything that comes before you right now because you have been burned and we have been burned. We have been burned by a process run amok. But now we're all here pretending that maybe it didn't happen, but it did. And we're relying on you to protect us from this. And you have to do your own due diligence. I don't believe you should accept any information given to you without proving it on your own. If you have a question about the actuarial studies, perform your own. Take your time. Make sure you don't make a mistake. You don't have to do this tonight, and I urge you not to. Do your due diligence. Make sure you protect the taxpayer's interest. You are the check and the balance. 2 more quick points. As far as the OPEB is concerned, I have a problem with the architecture of this plan, and the problem is a simple one. Because the money is put in, it grows over time as it's invested, but at the date of retirement, a fixed dollar amount is determined that will be taken out of the pile of money that the firefighter has accrued by taking 2% of his or her salary for 20 or 25 years, and the interest that it grows, and then we're just going to say, okay, every year we're going to remove from that pot of money X thousands of dollars. That ignores the ever-increasing escalating costs of health care, which right now Medicare and Medicaid says goes up 6.5% a year, but as somebody who buys health insurance for families in my business, I can assure you that if it only goes up 6 or 6.5%, I'm doing a jig. Because there are years where it goes up 12%, there's a couple of crisis years where it goes up 20%. So I don't know how we arrive at a fixed percentage and deem that fair to the taxpayers, especially because as that fund accrues value, we're potentially going to pay it back out the door when the firefighter retires. That's broken. It's really not right. It's really not fair. And I would urge you to consider that differently. I would also urge you to consider another element to the possible agreement of whether or not we choose to pay back the accrued